Although we find ourselves solitary today, gazing out at a world where we remain the only human species, this was not always the case. In fact, for most of our history, we were merely one character in a crowded cast of distinct human actors. 300,000 years ago, the Earth was a younger, wilder, and far more diverse place than the one we know now. If you could walk the continents back then, you would have encountered neighbors, at least 8 other kinds of people living their lives in parallel to ours. Some were taller, while others stood barely waist-high. Some possessed brains larger than our own, while others navigated their world with different kinds of intelligence. From the frozen tundras of the north to the tropical islands of the south, humanity was not a single note, but a chord. Imagine standing on a coastline that stretches much farther than today, with sea levels sitting 120 meters lower. In Europe, stocky figures with massive strength crouch around fires in deep limestone caves. These are the Neanderthals, built to endure the crushing cold of the Ice Age. They have lived there for millennia and will continue to thrive long before we arrive. Far to the south, in Africa, a different story unfolds. A small statured species, Homo naledi, moves through dark, narrow cave systems with a grace we can only imagine. They stand barely 5 feet tall, and though their hands resemble ours, their shoulders tell the story of a life spent climbing ancient trees. In the east, on the island of Java, the oldest of us all still walks along the riverbanks, Homo Erectus. They have wandered the earth for nearly 2 million years, mastering fire and stone long before our own lineage began. And on a tiny island in Indonesia, evolution is sculpting something unique. Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits. Small, efficient and resilient, they hunt pygmy elephants in a world that seems like a fantasy to us, yet was entirely real. Somewhere in the high mountains of Tibet, the mysterious Denisovans are adapting to the thin air, leaving behind genetic echoes that still live on in people today. And deeper still, in the genetic code of modern populations, we find whispers of other ghost lineages, species we have yet to name, but who walked the same earth under the same stars. This was the world as it truly was, a tangled bush of human life, not a straight line. We were not the inevitable destination, we were simply one of the branches. A newcomer in Africa, untested and unremarkable. We had no guarantee of survival. The Neanderthals had bigger brains. Homo erectus had endurance. The hobbits had resilience. And yet, here we are, alone. The last voices in an empty room. The question that haunts the silence is simple. What happened? How did a planet teeming with human diversity become the domain of just one? This is the story of those who came before, the story of the last time we were not alone. If you're enjoying this quiet journey, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Your city, your corner of the world. It's a reminder that even in a story about being alone, we aren't really alone. Now, before we meet them individually, we must ask a fundamental question. What does it actually mean to be human? Not in a philosophical sense, but in a biological one. What separates the genus Homo from all that came before? For a long time, the answer seemed simple. It was about the brain. We believed that to be human meant to be smart, with a large cranial capacity defining our membership in the club. But the Earth has a way of surprising us. When we discovered the small but sophisticated toolmakers on the island of Flores, or the ritualistic behaviors of the small-brained Homo naledi in South Africa, the old rules shattered. We realized that humanity is not defined by a single metric like brain size. It is not just about walking upright, for our ancestors did that millions of years ago. It is not just about tools, for birds and primates use them too. Instead, being human seems to be a constellation of traits, a mix of anatomy, behavior, and adaptability. It includes those who lived in the freezing cold and those who thrived in the tropics. It includes makers of fire and climbers of trees. The definition is broader, messier, and more beautiful than we once thought. Evolution does not march toward a specific goal. It does not necessarily preserve the strongest or the smartest. Often, it preserves the luckiest, those who happened to be in the right place when the climate shifted, or who found a way to survive when resources ran dry. We are here not because we were destined to be, but because our branch of the family tree managed to hold on, while others, one by one, snapped under the weight of time. Now let us turn the page back. Let us meet the survivor, the wanderer, the one who set the stage for everything that followed, the species that walked out of Africa and never stopped walking, Homo erectus. The first human to leave Africa did so nearly 2 million years ago, long before your species existed, long before the Neanderthals emerged, long before the concept of human had settled into anything resembling its modern form. This pioneer was Homo erectus, and their journey out of the ancestral homeland would prove to be one of the most successful dispersals in the history of our genus. While other species rose and fell within the confines of a single continent, Erectus spread across two, adapting to climates and landscapes that ranged from tropical forests to temperate woodlands, from river valleys to coastal plains. They were not the biggest-brained humans, nor the most advanced in their tool-making, but they possessed something perhaps more valuable than either of those traits. They had time. Homo erectus endured for nearly 1.9 million years, a span so vast that it dwarfs the entire existence of Homo sapiens by a factor of 9. If our species lives as long as Erectus did, we have another 1.6 million years ahead of us, though given our track record with climate and resources, that seems unlikely. Erectus, by contrast, weathered ice ages and interglacials, volcanic eruptions and droughts, the rise and fall of countless other species, all while maintaining a presence across Africa and Asia. The earliest fossils come from East Africa, dated to around 1.9 million years ago, where Erectus lived alongside other early humans including Homo habilis and Paranthropus boisei. They were taller than their predecessors, with longer legs and shorter arms, a body plan that finally severed the last anatomical ties to a life spent partially in trees. Walking upright was no longer a compromise, it was their entire strategy. Their legs carried them out of Africa and into the unknown, crossing into the Arabian Peninsula and then fanning out across Asia, reaching as far east as Java and as far north as the Caucasus. By 1.8 million years ago, Erectus had arrived in what is now the Republic of Georgia, where fossils from the site of Dmanisi reveal a population that was smaller-brained and more variable than later Erectus groups, suggesting that the species was still evolving even as it spread. From Georgia, some populations moved east into China, where they would eventually become known as Peking Man, while others pushed south into Indonesia, island hopping across land bridges exposed during periods of low sea level. It was on the island of Java that Erectus made its final stand, surviving there until approximately 117,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years after the species had vanished from mainland Asia and hundreds of thousands of years after it disappeared from Africa. This Javan population, discovered at a site called Njandong along the Solo River, represents the youngest and most advanced form of Homo erectus. 12 skulls and 2 leg bones were unearthed in the 1930s, and for decades their age remained uncertain, with estimates ranging wildly from 550,000 years old to as recent as 27,000 years ago. The younger dates were tantalizing because they suggested that Erectus had overlapped with Homo sapiens in Southeast Asia, perhaps even encountering one another in the forests and river valleys of Indonesia. However, more recent and rigorous dating, published in 2019, settled the question with greater confidence. The Ngandong fossils are between 117,000 and 108,000 years old, which means that while Erectus and Sapiens did exist at the same time, they occupied different regions and likely never met. By 117,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had been evolving in Africa for nearly 200,000 years, but there is no evidence that our species reached Java until around 73,000 years ago, at least 35,000 years after the last Erectus had disappeared. The gap is not accidental. It reflects the fact that Erectus, despite its long success, could not adapt to the rapid environmental changes that transformed Java during the late Pleistocene. Around 120,000 years ago, the climate shifted and the open woodlands and savannas that Erectus had thrived in for hundreds of thousands of years gave way to dense tropical rainforest. Erectus, with its reliance on open country hunting and its relatively conservative tool technology, could not make the transition. Within a few tens of thousands of years, they were gone. What made Erectus so successful for so long was not brilliance or innovation, but a kind of rugged competence. Their brains, averaging around 900 cubic centimeters, were significantly larger than those of earlier hominins, but smaller than those of later humans like Homo heidelbergensis and Homo sapiens. They made tools, primarily hand axes and cleavers in the Acheulean tradition, that were effective but largely unchanged for over 1 million years. They controlled fire, though exactly when and how consistently remains debated, with the earliest solid evidence coming from a site in Israel dated to around 790,000 years ago. Fire would have given them the ability to cook food, stay warm in colder climates, and defend against predators, all of which expanded the range of environments they could inhabit. They hunted large game, worked cooperatively, and likely possessed some form of language or proto-language, though the evidence for this is indirect and based mostly on the complexity of their social organization and tool-making. They were, in short, recognizably human in their behavior, even if their anatomy remained distinct. Their skulls were thick-boned and robust, with heavy brow ridges and a long, low brain case that lacked the high, rounded dome characteristic of later Homo. Their faces projected forward, and they had no chin, a feature that would not appear until the evolution of Homo sapiens. By the time Erectus went extinct on Java, the world had changed dramatically. In Africa, Homo sapiens had already begun its expansion, carrying with it more sophisticated tools, complex symbolic thought, and perhaps a more flexible approach to problem solving. In Europe, the Neanderthals were thriving, adapted perfectly to the cold. In the high mountains of Asia, the Denisovans were quietly evolving in isolation. And in the caves of southern Africa, Homo naledi was doing something that still puzzles scientists, placing their dead in deep, inaccessible chambers for reasons we may never fully understand. Homo erectus, the great survivor, the wanderer who had seen 2 million years of planetary history, was not there to witness what came next. They left behind only bones and tools scattered across 2 continents, silent testimony to a life lived long and widely. They were the first to walk out of Africa, the first to master fire, the first to prove that humanity could thrive beyond the cradle. But they were not the last, and in the end, they were not the ones who endured. If Homo erectus was the great wanderer, then Homo heidelbergensis was the great ancestor, the last common thread connecting the 3 most successful human lineages that would dominate the planet for the next 500,000 years. This species emerged around 700,000 years ago, likely evolving from late populations of Homo erectus in Africa, and by 500,000 years ago had spread across much of the Old World, reaching Europe, Western Asia, and possibly even parts of Eastern Asia, though the fossil record there remains ambiguous. Heidelbergensis was not a single uniform population, but rather a collection of regional variants that shared enough anatomical features to be grouped together, at least provisionally, under one name. The first fossil assigned to this species was discovered in 1907 near the German town of Heidelberg, where workers digging in a sandpit unearthed a massive jawbone that belonged to no living human and resembled no known fossil at the time. The jaw was enormous, heavily built, and completely lacked a chin, yet the teeth were surprisingly small and modern-looking, a combination of traits that suggested something intermediate between the ancient Homo erectus and the more recent Neanderthals. Otto Schoetensack, the German anthropologist who described the specimen, named it Homo heidelbergensis and proposed that it represented an early European ancestor, though he could not have known just how central this species would become to the story of human evolution. Over the following decades, more fossils emerged from across Africa and Europe, each adding pieces to the puzzle. A skull from Broken Hill in Zambia, massive-browed and thick-boned, was initially called Rhodesian man, but is now considered an African heidelbergensis. A partial skull from Petrolona in Greece, another from Arago in France, and a remarkable collection of bones from Cima de los Huesos in Spain all bore the hallmarks of this widespread and variable species. What united them was a brain size that hovered around 1,200 cubic centimeters, significantly larger than Erectus, but not quite reaching the upper limits seen in Neanderthals and modern humans. Their skulls retained heavy brow ridges and thick cranial bones, relics of their Erectus ancestry. But the back of the skull had begun to round out, and the face, while still projecting forward, was less extreme than in earlier species. Heidelbergensis was the first human to master the Levallois technique, a sophisticated method of stone tool production that required forward planning and an understanding of how stone fractures. Unlike the simple hand axes of Erectus, which were made by striking flakes off a core until the desired shape emerged, Levallois tools were made by carefully preparing the core first, shaping it so that a single, well-placed blow would detach a flake of predetermined size and shape. This technique produced sharper, more efficient tools and demonstrated a level of cognitive sophistication that suggested Heidelbergensis was thinking several steps ahead, visualizing the final product before the work even began. They were also skilled hunters, as evidenced by the discovery of wooden spears at Schöningen in Germany, dated to around 400,000 years ago. These spears were not simple sharpened sticks, but carefully crafted weapons, balanced and designed for throwing with the center of gravity positioned to maximize accuracy and distance. The presence of horse bones at the same site, some bearing cut marks from stone tools, suggests that Heidelbergensis was hunting large game and doing so with remarkable success. Fire was part of their toolkit as well, with evidence of controlled burning appearing at sites across their range, including hearths in Israel that date back nearly 800,000 years. Whether Heidelbergensis possessed language is unknown, but the complexity of their tools, the coordination required for group hunting, and the evidence of long-distance trade networks, stones sourced from quarries dozens of kilometers away, all point to a level of communication that went beyond simple gestures and grunts. If they did not have language in the fully modern sense, they were close, perhaps speaking in something that linguists might call proto-language, a system capable of conveying concrete information but lacking the recursive grammar and infinite expressiveness of what you speak today. Around 400,000 years ago, something began to happen within the Heidelbergensis populations. Regional differences that had always existed started to deepen, driven by geography, climate, and the simple fact that populations separated by thousands of kilometers rarely interbred. In Europe, the Heidelbergensis populations began evolving traits that would eventually define the Neanderthals. Shorter, stockier bodies adapted to cold, larger nasal cavities for warming, frigid air, and a subtle reshaping of the skull that emphasized the occipital bun at the back of the head. By 400,000 years ago, some European fossils, particularly those from Cima de los Huesos, already looked more Neanderthal than heidelbergensis, suggesting that the split had begun even if it was not yet complete. In Africa, a different trajectory was underway. The heidelbergensis populations there retained longer limbs and more gracile builds, adaptations suited to tropical and subtropical climates where heat dissipation mattered more than heat retention. Over time, these African populations would evolve into Homo sapiens, though the transition was gradual and the exact timing remains uncertain. By 300,000 years ago, the earliest fossils that can be called anatomically modern humans had appeared in Morocco and Ethiopia, bearing skulls that were higher, rounder and less robust than those of their heidelbergensis ancestors, though still retaining some archaic features. Meanwhile, in Asia, another branch was quietly diverging. The evidence is sparse, mostly genetic rather than fossil, but it suggests that some heidelbergensis populations moved eastward into Central and Eastern Asia, where they evolved in isolation into the Denisovans, a lineage that remained hidden from science until the discovery of a single finger bone in a Siberian cave in 2010. The Denisovans interbred with both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, leaving genetic traces in modern human populations, particularly those of Melanesia and Tibet. But their physical appearance remains a mystery because no complete skeleton has ever been found. By 200,000 years ago, Homo heidelbergensis as a distinct species had effectively vanished, not through extinction but through transformation. The lineage did not die out. It split into three, each branch taking with it a portion of the ancestral genome and adapting it to the specific challenges of a particular region. In Europe, heidelbergensis became the Neanderthals. In Africa, it became Homo sapiens. In Asia, it became the Denisovans. These three species would go on to dominate the planet for the next 150,000 years, overlapping in time and occasionally in space, sometimes interbreeding, sometimes competing, sometimes simply coexisting in parallel. Heidelbergensis, then, was not a dead end, but a crossroads. It was the last moment in human evolution when a single species spanned continents and held the potential to become something new. After Heidelbergensis, there would be no more pan-continental human species, no more single lineage connecting Africa, Europe, and Asia. Instead, there would be divergence, specialization, and eventually, the slow convergence back toward a single surviving species, yours. But 300,000 years ago, that outcome was far from certain. The world was full of humans, and Heidelbergensis had just finished splitting into three. The stage was set. The players were in position. What happened next would determine which branch survived and which faded into the fossil record, remembered only as bones in the ground and whispers in the genome. 300,000 years ago, the world had reached a kind of peak in human diversity, a moment when the genus Homo was represented by more distinct forms than at any other point in its 2-million-year history. This was not the chaotic free-for-all that the term diversity might suggest, with different species packed into the same valleys and competing for the same resources. Instead, it was a pattern of separation and specialization, with each lineage occupying its own niche, its own climate zone, its own corner of the habitable world. Geography had sorted them, and for the moment at least, there was room enough for everyone. In Europe, the descendants of Homo heidelbergensis were well on their way to becoming Neanderthals, their bodies already adapting to the cold through shorter limbs, barrel-shaped chests, and noses designed to warm icy air before it reached the lungs. They lived in limestone caves and rock shelters scattered across France, Spain, Germany, and the Balkans, hunting reindeer and bison with wooden spears and controlling fire with a competence that suggested it had been part of their culture for tens of thousands of years. Their tools were sophisticated, their social groups cohesive, and their brains, measured by the fossils that would eventually be found, were among the largest ever evolved by any human species. In Africa, Homo sapiens was emerging from its Heidelbergensis ancestry, though the transition was not yet complete and would not be for another 100,000 years. The earliest members of your species were anatomically modern in some respects. Higher foreheads, rounder skulls, more gracile faces, but still retained enough archaic features that if you encountered one on the street today, you might hesitate before calling them fully human. They lived in small bands, moving seasonally across landscapes that ranged from Mediterranean coastlines to highland plateaus, adapting their toolkits and hunting strategies to whatever environment they found themselves in. They were generalists in a world increasingly dominated by specialists, and that flexibility, though unremarkable at the time, would eventually prove decisive. Far to the east, in the mountains and valleys of Central Asia, the Denisovans were thriving in isolation, their lineage having split from the Neanderthals sometime around 400,000 years ago. Almost nothing is known about their physical appearance because the fossil record has yielded only fragments: a finger bone, a few teeth, a piece of jaw found on the Tibetan plateau. But their DNA tells a story of adaptation to extreme environments. Some Denisovan populations evolved genes that allowed them to process oxygen more efficiently at high altitudes, a trait that survives today in modern Tibetan and Sherpa populations. Others moved south into warmer regions, interbreeding with early Homo sapiens and leaving genetic traces in the indigenous peoples of Melanesia, Australia, and the Philippines. On the Indonesian island of Java, Homo erectus was entering the final phase of its existence, still hunting along the Solo River as it had for more than 1,000,000 years, unaware that the climate was shifting beneath its feet. The open woodlands and savannas that had sustained erectus populations for so long were giving way to dense rainforest, and the species, with its conservative tool technology and reliance on familiar prey, could not adapt quickly enough. Within a few tens of thousands of years, they would be gone, the last survivors of a lineage that had once spanned 2 continents. On smaller islands scattered across Southeast Asia, stranger things were happening. On Flores, a population of humans had undergone island dwarfism, shrinking over hundreds of thousands of years until they stood barely a meter tall, with brains no larger than a chimpanzee's. Homo floresiensis had arrived on the island perhaps 700,000 years ago, possibly as descendants of Erectus, and had adapted to the limited resources by evolving smaller bodies that required less food. Despite their tiny brains, they made sophisticated stone tools and hunted the island's pygmy elephants, suggesting that intelligence was not strictly a function of brain size. On Luzon, another island population was evolving in parallel, though the fossil evidence is far more limited: a few teeth, a handful of finger and toe bones, enough to establish that Homo luzonensis existed, but not enough to say much about how it lived or what it looked like. In southern Africa, deep within a cave system that would not be explored by modern humans until 2013, Homo naledi was doing something that still baffles scientists. This small-bodied, small-brained species, with hands built for precision and feet made for walking long distances, was somehow navigating dark, narrow passages to reach chambers far from the cave entrance, where they left the bodies of their dead. Whether this was intentional burial, ritual behavior, or something else entirely remains unknown, but the fact that it happened at all challenges assumptions about what small-brained hominins were capable of. Naledi had a cranial capacity of only 500 cubic centimeters, yet if the evidence is to be believed, they were engaging in symbolic behavior that would not seem out of place among much larger-brained species. And then there were the ghost populations, the ones we know about only through genetics, shadows in the genome of modern humans that hint at species we have not yet found or may never find. DNA extracted from the bones of sub-Saharan Africans shows traces of interbreeding with archaic humans that diverged from the main Homo lineage hundreds of thousands of years ago. But no fossils have been matched to these genetic signatures. They existed, these unknown humans, living somewhere in Africa alongside early Homo sapiens, interbreeding occasionally, contributing genes that survive in populations today. Who they were, what they looked like, where they lived, all of this remains a mystery, one that may only be solved if the right bones are found in the right place and dated to the right time. This, then, was the world 300,000 years ago. At least 9 species, possibly more, all recognizably human in the broad sense but different enough that had they met, they would have known immediately that the other was something distinct. Some had massive brains and sophisticated cultures. Some had tiny brains and survived on remote islands. Some buried their dead in caves. Some left Africa and never returned. Some never left at all. They were all experimenting in their own ways with what it meant to be human, and for a brief moment in geological time, all of those experiments were running simultaneously. None of them knew that the experiment was about to end, that within another 260,000 years, only one species would remain, that the bush, so thick and tangled and full of branches, was about to be pruned down to a single stem. They could not have known, because evolution does not telegraph its intentions, and extinction does not announce itself until it is already too late. The question is not whether they could have survived. The question is why only one of them did. The Neanderthals were not supposed to be your cousins. When the first skeleton was pulled from a limestone cave in Germany's Neander Valley in 1856, naturalists examined the heavy brow ridges, the robust bones, and the strangely curved limbs, and many concluded that this was something ancient and primitive, perhaps even a different species entirely, one that had lived and died long before modern humans walked the earth. The idea that this creature might be closely related to Europeans, that it might have lived alongside anatomically modern humans, and possibly even interbred with them, seemed preposterous. Yet over the next century and a half, as more fossils emerged from caves across Europe and Western Asia, the picture shifted. The Neanderthals were not distant evolutionary cousins separated by millions of years. They were our siblings, having diverged from a common ancestor perhaps as recently as 400,000 years ago, and for tens of thousands of years, they had been far more successful in Europe than Homo sapiens would ever be. Neanderthals evolved from Homo heidelbergensis populations that had been living in Europe for several 100,000 years, gradually adapting to the harsh glacial climates that dominated the continent during much of the Middle and Late Pleistocene. Ice ages came and went in cycles, each lasting tens of thousands of years, and the Neanderthals evolved to survive them all. Their bodies were stocky and powerfully built, with shorter limbs and broader torsos than modern humans, a body plan that minimized surface area and conserved heat in freezing temperatures. Their nasal cavities were enormous, designed to warm and humidify frigid air before it reached the lungs, and their faces projected forward to accommodate these large noses. Every aspect of their anatomy spoke to life in the cold, efficient, adapted, refined over hundreds of thousands of years. Their brains were larger than yours, averaging around 1,500 cubic centimeters compared to the modern human average of 1,400. This fact alone should dispel any lingering notion that Neanderthals were dim-witted brutes, though such stereotypes persisted for much of the 20th century and still surface occasionally in popular culture. Brain size is not a perfect measure of intelligence, as the existence of Homo naledi and Homo floresiensis makes clear, but it is not irrelevant either, and the Neanderthals had brains that were not only large but also organized differently from yours. The occipital lobe, responsible for processing visual information, was proportionally larger, while the frontal lobe, associated with abstract reasoning and planning, was somewhat smaller. Whether this made them better or worse at specific cognitive tasks is impossible to say with certainty, but it suggests that their minds worked in ways that were not quite the same as a modern human's. They were toolmakers of considerable skill, producing implements in the Mousterian tradition that included scrapers, points, and carefully shaped hand axes, all made using the Levallois technique inherited from their Heidelbergensis ancestors. Some Neanderthal populations went further, developing tools that showed regional variation and innovation, suggesting that they had distinct cultural traditions that were passed down through generations. In southwestern France, Neanderthals created blade tools that were lighter and sharper than anything their ancestors had made. In Italy, they fashioned tools from obsidian, a volcanic glass that required skill to work but produced edges sharper than steel. And in the Levant, where Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens overlapped geographically, both species made nearly identical stone tools, a fact that complicates any attempt to distinguish one group from the other based solely on archaeology. Fire was central to Neanderthal life, not merely as a source of warmth, but as a technology that structured their days and defined their living spaces. Evidence from caves across Europe shows that Neanderthals built hearths with care, arranging stones to contain the flames and positioning them in locations that maximized heat distribution and smoke ventilation. They cooked their food, which would have made tough plant materials more digestible and allowed them to extract more calories from meat, and they almost certainly used fire for other purposes as well, hardening wooden spears, keeping predators at bay, perhaps even as a social focal point around which groups gathered in the evening. The control of fire is one of the defining characteristics of the genus Homo, but the Neanderthals elevated it to an art. What is most remarkable about the Neanderthals, and what separates them most clearly from earlier human species, is the evidence of symbolic thought. At the site of Shanidar Cave in Iraq, excavations in the 1950s uncovered the skeleton of a Neanderthal man who had been buried deliberately, his body placed in a shallow grave and possibly accompanied by flowers, as suggested by pollen grains found in the surrounding soil. The interpretation of this burial has been debated for decades, with some researchers arguing that the pollen could have been introduced by burrowing rodents or wind, but even if the flowers are discounted, the intentional burial itself is significant. Burial implies recognition of death as something more than a biological event, an acknowledgement that the deceased was someone worth remembering, someone whose body should not simply be left to scavengers. More recent discoveries have strengthened the case for Neanderthal symbolic behavior. In Spain, cave paintings dated to more than 64,000 years ago, well before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe, have been attributed to Neanderthals based on the age of the mineral deposits covering the pigments. The paintings are simple by modern standards, consisting mostly of geometric shapes and hand stencils, but the act of creating them demonstrates an impulse toward representation, a desire to mark the world with symbols that carry meaning. In Croatia, Neanderthals fashioned jewelry from eagle talons, stringing them together to create what appears to be a necklace or bracelet, and in France they carved patterns into bone and antler, though whether these were decorative, functional, or symbolic remains unclear. The question of whether Neanderthals possessed language has been argued endlessly, with no definitive answer. Their hyoid bone, which anchors the tongue and larynx, is shaped like yours, suggesting that the anatomy for speech was present, and recent genetic studies have shown that Neanderthals carried a version of the FOXP2 gene that is nearly identical to the one found in modern humans. FOXP2 is associated with the fine motor control required for speech, and mutations in this gene cause severe language impairments in humans today. That Neanderthals shared this version implies that they had at least the biological capacity for language, though whether they used it in the same way you do is impossible to determine. Their brains were wired differently, their social groups were smaller, and the demands placed on their communication systems may have been different enough that language, if it existed, took a form you would not recognize. They lived in Europe for more than 300,000 years, weathering multiple glacial cycles and adapting to climates that ranged from temperate forests during warm interglacials to frozen steppe tundra during ice ages. Their populations were never large, perhaps numbering in the tens of thousands at most, spread thinly across a vast territory that extended from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the Altai mountains of Siberia. They hunted woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, reindeer, horses, and bison, using ambush tactics and cooperative strategies that required planning and coordination. Some Neanderthal sites show evidence of mass kills, where entire herds were driven over cliffs or into dead-end valleys, suggesting that they were capable of the kind of large-scale cooperative hunting that anthropologists once believed was unique to Homo sapiens. Despite their adaptations and their success, the Neanderthals began to decline around 50,000 years ago, just as Homo sapiens was expanding out of Africa and into Europe. The two species overlapped for at least 10,000 years, possibly longer, and during that time they interbred. Genetic studies have confirmed that all non-African humans today carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA, evidence of encounters that happened somewhere in the Middle East or southern Europe tens of thousands of years ago. The interbreeding was not extensive, and it may have been limited to a few isolated events, but it was enough to leave a permanent mark on the modern human genome. By 40,000 years ago, Neanderthal populations had dwindled to a few isolated refugees in southern Spain and the Balkans, and by 39,000 years ago, even these last holdouts had disappeared. The reasons for their extinction remain debated, with climate change, competition with Homo sapiens, and disease all proposed as contributing factors. The truth is likely a combination of all three, compounded by the fact that Neanderthal populations were small and fragmented, making them vulnerable to any disruption. They did not vanish because they were inferior. They vanished because the world changed, and they could not change fast enough. What survives of them is not their bones alone, but the genes they passed on, still present in billions of people today. Those genes affect everything from immune function to skin color, from the shape of your nose to your tolerance for pain. The Neanderthals are not extinct in the way that Homo erectus is extinct. They were absorbed, integrated into the expanding populations of Homo sapiens, their DNA diluted but never entirely lost. In that sense, they are still here, a permanent part of what it means to be human, a reminder that you are not purely one thing but a composite, a mixture of lineages that once walked the earth as separate species. The Denisovans are the most enigmatic of all the human species that lived 300,000 years ago, not because they left behind no evidence of their existence, quite the opposite, but because what they left behind is so fragmentary and scattered that piecing together a coherent picture of who they were remains one of the great challenges of paleoanthropology. Unlike the Neanderthals, whose fossils number in the thousands and whose anatomy is well understood, the Denisovans are known from a handful of bone fragments so small they could fit in the palm of your hand, a finger bone from a teenage girl, a few molars, a piece of jawbone found on a windswept Tibetan plateau. That is all the physical evidence we have, and yet from these tiny fragments, scientists have extracted something extraordinary. A complete genome that reveals a lineage as distinct and significant as the Neanderthals, one that interbred with both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and left genetic traces in populations that stretch from Siberia to the islands of the South Pacific. The first Denisovan fossil was discovered in 2008 by Russian archaeologists excavating Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, a remote and desolate region that sits near the border between Russia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan and China. The cave had been occupied intermittently for tens of thousands of years, and its sediments contained stone tools and animal bones that suggested it had served as a shelter for ancient humans, though exactly which species had lived there was unclear. Among the bones recovered from the deepest layers was a tiny finger bone, no larger than a thumbnail, belonging to a juvenile female who had died sometime between 30,000 and 50,000 years ago. At first, the bone seemed unremarkable, just another fragment in a collection that already included remains from Neanderthals and modern humans. But when geneticists extracted DNA from the bone and sequenced it, they discovered something unexpected. The DNA did not match that of Neanderthals or Homo sapiens. It was something else entirely. The genome revealed that this girl belonged to a lineage that had split from the Neanderthals roughly 400,000 years ago, around the same time that both groups had diverged from the ancestors of Homo sapiens. The Denisovans, as they came to be called after the cave where they were found, were a sister species to the Neanderthals, sharing a more recent common ancestor with them than either group shared with modern humans. Yet, despite this close relationship, the Denisovans had evolved independently for hundreds of thousands of years, adapting to environments and climates that were different from those occupied by the Neanderthals, and in the process they had become genetically distinct enough to be considered a separate species, or at the very least, a deeply divergent population. The discovery of this new lineage raised as many questions as it answered. If the Denisovans were real, and the DNA left no doubt that they were, then where had they lived, what had they looked like, and how had they interacted with other human species? The cave in Siberia provided only limited clues. The stone tools found in the same layers as the finger bone were generic, indistinguishable from those made by Neanderthals or early Homo sapiens, offering no insight into whether the Denisovans had a distinct culture or technology. The few additional bones that were eventually identified as Denisovan, 3 molars and a toe bone from the same cave, plus a jawbone discovered years later in Tibet, were too fragmentary to reconstruct what a Denisovan might have looked like, though the molars were unusually large, suggesting that whoever made them had been robust and possibly quite large-bodied. The jawbone from Tibet, found in 2019 at an elevation of more than 3,000 meters on the Tibetan plateau, was perhaps the most revealing of all the Denisovan fossils, though it too was incomplete, consisting only of a partial mandible with 2 molars still attached. What made this fossil significant was not just its location, at an altitude where oxygen levels are 30% lower than at sea level, but the proteins extracted from the bone, which confirmed that it belonged to a Denisovan who had lived at least 160,000 years ago. This pushed the timeline of Denisovan occupation in high-altitude Asia back by more than 100,000 years and suggested that this lineage had adapted to one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth long before Homo sapiens even attempted to live there. The genetic evidence supports this idea of high-altitude adaptation. Modern Tibetan and Sherpa populations carry a gene variant called EPAS1, which helps the body process oxygen more efficiently at high elevations, reducing the risk of altitude sickness and allowing people to live and work in environments where most humans would struggle to survive. This gene variant is extremely rare in lowland populations and is virtually absent in Europeans and Africans, but it is common in Tibetans, and genetic analysis has shown that it did not evolve independently in these populations. Instead, it was inherited from the Denisovans, passed on through interbreeding that occurred tens of thousands of years ago when early Homo sapiens migrating into Asia encountered Denisovan groups that had already been living in the highlands for countless generations. This pattern of interbreeding is not unique to Tibet. Across Asia and the Pacific, the Denisovan genetic signature appears in surprising places, far from the Siberian cave where the first fossil was found. Populations in Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, and Aboriginal Australia carry between 4 and 6% Denisovan DNA, a proportion that is significantly higher than the Neanderthal contribution found in Europeans and Asians. The presence of Denisovan genes in these regions suggests that at some point in the deep past, probably between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago, Homo sapiens migrating through Southeast Asia encountered Denisovan populations and interbred with them, absorbing Denisovan genes into the expanding modern human population. Some of those genes provided advantages in the new environments that Homo sapiens was colonizing. Genes related to immune function, metabolism, and even diving ability, which may explain why the Bajau people of the Philippines, who spend much of their lives underwater hunting fish, carry specific genetic variants that appear to have Denisovan origins. The geographic range implied by these genetic traces is staggering. If Denisovans contributed DNA to populations in Siberia, Tibet, Melanesia, and Australia, then they must have occupied a vast swath of Asia, stretching from the frozen north to the tropical south, from highland plateaus to coastal lowlands. Yet despite this enormous range, they have left behind almost no physical evidence, no complete skeletons, no clear archaeological sites, no distinctive tools or art that can be definitively attributed to them. They are ghosts, known almost entirely through their DNA, and the lack of fossils means that basic questions about their appearance, their behavior, and their culture remain unanswered. What little can be inferred comes from genetic and comparative analysis. The large molars suggest that Denisovans may have had robust jaws and possibly large bodies, perhaps comparable in size to the Neanderthals, or even larger. The diversity in their genome indicates that they were not a single, homogeneous population, but rather a collection of groups that had been separated by geography and time, some of which may have diverged from one another as much as Neanderthals diverged from Homo sapiens. In fact, the Denisovan genome shows evidence of interbreeding not just with Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, but also with an unknown archaic human species that diverged from the main line of Homo evolution even earlier, possibly a remnant population of Homo erectus that had survived in Eastern Asia long after the species had disappeared elsewhere. If this interpretation is correct, then the Denisovans were hybrids themselves, carrying genes from multiple lineages and occupying a position in the human family tree that is far more complex than a simple branching diagram would suggest. By 40,000 years ago, the Denisovans, like the Neanderthals, had disappeared as a distinct population, though exactly when and how this happened is unknown. There are no Denisovan fossils dated to less than 40,000 years ago, and no clear archaeological evidence of their presence after that time. But the genetic record suggests that they may have persisted longer in some regions than in others, lingering in isolated pockets of Asia even as Homo sapiens spread across the continent. If they did survive longer, they left no trace that has yet been discovered, and their final extinction or absorption into the modern human gene pool remains one of the many unanswered questions surrounding this mysterious species. What is certain is that the Denisovans were real, that they were widespread, and that they contributed significantly to the genetic makeup of modern humans in ways that are still being discovered. Every new genome that is sequenced, every ancient bone that is analyzed, reveals a little more about who they were and where they lived, and it is possible that future excavations in Asia will uncover more complete fossils that finally allow scientists to reconstruct what a Denisovan looked like. Until then, they remained phantoms, known by their DNA but invisible in almost every other way, a reminder that the human story is far richer and more tangled than the fossil record alone can reveal. Islands have a way of producing unexpected forms of life, and this is true not just for birds and lizards and insects, but for mammals as well, including humans. When populations become isolated on islands with limited resources and no large predators, evolution often pushes them towards smaller body sizes, a phenomenon known as island dwarfism. Elephants shrink to the size of ponies. Hippos become no larger than sheep. Deer evolve into creatures barely bigger than rabbits. The logic is straightforward. Smaller bodies require less food, and on an island where food is scarce, the individuals that need less of it are the ones most likely to survive and reproduce. Over tens of thousands of years, entire populations can shrink dramatically, generation by generation, until what emerges is a miniature version of what once was large. This is what happened on the Indonesian island of Flores, though no one suspected it until September 2003, when a team of Australian and Indonesian archaeologists excavating a limestone cave called Liang Bua uncovered a nearly complete skeleton buried in sediment layers that were tens of thousands of years old. The skeleton was small, far smaller than any adult human should be, and the initial assumption was that it belonged to a child. But as the bones were cleaned and examined, it became clear that this was not a child at all. The teeth were fully erupted and heavily worn, the skull sutures were fused, and the pelvis showed the characteristic shape of an adult female. She had been fully grown when she died, and yet she stood no taller than 1 meter, roughly the height of a modern 3-year-old. Her brain, measured from the volume of the cranial cavity, was approximately 400 cubic centimeters, smaller than that of any known adult Homo and closer in size to the brains of Australopithecines that had lived millions of years earlier. The discovery was so unexpected, so contrary to prevailing ideas about human evolution, that many scientists initially refused to believe it represented a distinct species. Perhaps this individual had suffered from microcephaly, a developmental disorder that results in an abnormally small brain and skull. Perhaps it was an example of a rare genetic condition that stunted growth. Perhaps it was simply a statistical outlier, a single abnormal individual who happened to be buried in a cave and happened to be found by archaeologists. The problem with these explanations, however, was that the excavations at Liang Bua eventually uncovered bones from at least 12 additional individuals, all of them similarly small, all of them adults, and all of them dating to periods spanning from roughly 100,000 to 60,000 years ago, with some indications that the species might have survived even longer. This was not a single anomalous individual. This was an entire population, a distinct species that had lived on Flores for tens of thousands of years and possibly much longer. The species was named Homo floresiensis, and almost immediately it was nicknamed the Hobbit by the press, a name that stuck despite the objections of some scientists who felt it trivialized the discovery. The nickname was apt though, because these were indeed small people living in a world full of other strange, miniaturized creatures. Flores, during the time when Floresiensis lived there, was home to pygmy elephants called stegodon, dwarf versions of the massive elephants that roamed mainland Asia, as well as giant rats, enormous lizards, and flightless birds. The island had been isolated from the rest of Indonesia for millions of years, separated by deep ocean channels that even during the lowest sea levels of the ice ages never disappeared. And this isolation had created a kind of evolutionary laboratory where the normal rules of size and proportion were bent and reshaped by the peculiar pressures of island life. The tools found alongside the Floresiensis skeletons were surprisingly sophisticated given the size of their brains. Stone blades, scrapers, and points, all made using techniques that required planning and skill, were scattered throughout the cave deposits, and some of the animal bones bore cut marks that indicated the inhabitants had been butchering game. The presence of charred bone and burnt sediment suggested that Floresiensis had controlled fire, though the evidence is not as clear-cut as it is for Neanderthals or Homo erectus. Whether they hunted the pygmy elephants or simply scavenged their carcasses is unknown, but the stone tools were certainly capable of processing meat, and the wear patterns on Floresiensis teeth indicate that they had a diet that included both animal and plant foods. The origins of Homo floresiensis remain a subject of intense debate. The most widely accepted hypothesis is that they descended from a population of Homo erectus that reached Flores sometime around 700,000 years ago, possibly even earlier, and then became isolated on the island, where they gradually evolved smaller bodies and smaller brains in response to the limited resources available. This would make Floresiensis a dwarfed version of Erectus, a lineage that had taken a radically different evolutionary path from its mainland relatives. The alternative hypothesis, favored by some researchers, is that Floresiensis descended from an even earlier hominin, perhaps Homo habilis or something similar, that left Africa long before Erectus did and somehow made it all the way to Southeast Asia. This would explain why Floresiensis has some anatomical features, such as the shape of the wrist bones and the proportions of the feet, that resemble those of much older hominins rather than Erectus. Whichever origin story is correct, the existence of Floresiensis challenges one of the most deeply held assumptions about human evolution, which is that brain size and cognitive ability are tightly linked, and that the trend over time has been toward larger brains and greater intelligence. Floresiensis had a brain the size of a chimpanzee's, and yet they made stone tools, used fire, hunted or scavenged large animals, and survived on an isolated island for hundreds of thousands of years. This suggests that intelligence, at least in the practical sense of being able to solve problems and adapt to changing environments, is not strictly a function of brain size. It suggests that neural organization, the efficiency of connections, and the specific demands of the environment all play roles that are at least as important as the sheer volume of brain tissue. The question of when Homo floresiensis finally went extinct is complicated by the fact that the most recent fossils from Liangbua date to around 60,000 years ago, but stone tools attributed to Floresiensis have been found in younger layers, some as recent as 50,000 years ago. This raises the possibility that the species survived until relatively recent times, perhaps even long enough to overlap with the first Homo sapiens to reach Flores, which would have been sometime between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago. If they did overlap, there is no evidence that the two species interacted, no genetic signature of interbreeding in modern human populations, and no archaeological hints of contact. The hobbits simply disappear from the record, and what happened to them, whether they were outcompeted by incoming Homo sapiens, killed off by disease, or driven to extinction by some environmental catastrophe, remains unknown. What makes the Floresiensis story even stranger is that their disappearance may not have been the end of their legacy. On Flores today, local oral traditions speak of a small, human-like creature called Ebu Gogo, described as standing no taller than a child, covered in hair, and speaking in a language that the villagers could not understand. According to the stories, the Ebu Gogo lived in caves, stole food from villages, and could repeat words back to humans like parrots, though without understanding. The tales say that the Ebu Gogo were wiped out by the villagers several centuries ago, driven into a cave and killed by fire and smoke. Anthropologists have long dismissed these stories as folklore, but the discovery of Homo floresiensis has prompted some to reconsider. Could the Ebu Gogo be a cultural memory of Floresiensis, a distant echo of encounters that happened thousands of years ago and were passed down through generations of storytelling? There is no way to prove it, and most scientists remain skeptical, but the possibility lingers, a tantalizing hint that the hobbits of Flores may have survived far longer than the fossil record suggests. Whether or not the Ibu Gogo stories have any basis in fact, the existence of Homo floresiensis is undeniable, and its implications are profound. Evolution, it turns out, is not a one-way march toward bigger brains and taller bodies. It is a process of adaptation to local conditions, and sometimes those conditions favor getting smaller, not larger. The hobbits of Flores were not failed humans or evolutionary dead ends. They were a successful species that thrived in their environment for hundreds of thousands of years, longer than Homo sapiens has yet existed, and they did so with brains no larger than an orange. That alone should force a rethinking of what it means to be intelligent, what it means to be human, and what kinds of evolutionary paths are possible when populations are isolated and left to evolve on their own terms. The discovery of Homo floresiensis on the island of Flores prompted archaeologists to begin looking more carefully at other islands in Southeast Asia, searching for signs that island dwarfism might have produced additional small-bodied human species in the region. The Philippines, an archipelago of more than 7,000 islands that has been isolated from the Asian mainland for millions of years, seemed like a promising place to look. And in 2007, researchers excavating Callao Cave on the island of Luzon found a single foot bone that appeared to belong to a small-bodied hominin. The bone was dated to at least 67,000 years ago, making it roughly contemporaneous with the youngest Homo floresiensis fossils, but the fragment was too small and too ambiguous to identify definitively, and for more than a decade it remained a curiosity, a hint of something interesting but not enough to draw firm conclusions. Then, in 2019, the same team announced that they had found additional bones in the cave: teeth, finger bones, toe bones, and a fragment of femur, all belonging to at least 3 different individuals, and all displaying a combination of features that did not match any known human species. The teeth were small and simple, similar to those of Homo sapiens, but the toe and finger bones were curved in a way that suggested the individuals had been capable of climbing, a trait more commonly associated with ancient hominins like Australopithecus or early Homo, rather than later species like Erectus or Sapiens. The foot bones showed a mix of primitive and modern characteristics, with some features resembling those of Floresiensis and others looking more like the feet of much older hominins. It was a mosaic, a patchwork of traits that did not fit neatly into any existing category, and after careful analysis, the researchers concluded that they were looking at a new species, which they named Homo luzonensis. The discovery raised immediate questions, the most pressing of which was how Luzonensis had gotten to Luzon in the first place. Unlike Flores, which could be reached from the Asian mainland by crossing relatively short stretches of open water during periods when sea levels were low, Luzon has never been connected to the mainland by a land bridge, not even during the most extreme ice ages when global sea levels dropped by more than 120 meters. The island sits on the opposite side of a deep ocean trench that has remained a formidable barrier for millions of years, and reaching it from the mainland would have required crossing at least 50 kilometers of open ocean, possibly more depending on the route taken. For Homo erectus or any of its descendants, this would have been an extraordinary feat, one that implies a level of seafaring capability that most anthropologists did not think was possible for early humans. There are a few possible explanations. The first is that Luzonensis or its ancestors did not intentionally sail to Luzon, but were accidentally swept out to sea, perhaps clinging to floating debris after a storm, or riding natural rafts made of vegetation that had been washed into the ocean by floods. Accidental ocean crossings like this have been documented in modern times, and while they are rare, they do happen, and over hundreds of thousands of years, even a rare event can occur multiple times. The second possibility is that early humans in Southeast Asia were more capable of building watercraft and navigating open water than previously believed, and that the crossing to Luzon was intentional. carried out by groups who understood the risks and had the technology to manage them. If this is true, then it would push back the origins of seafaring by tens of thousands of years and force a re-evaluation of what early Homo species were capable of. The anatomy of Homo luzonensis offers few clues about which explanation is correct. The curved fingers and toes suggest that luzonensis retained the ability to climb trees, a useful trait in the dense tropical forests of Luzon, where much of the island's food resources, fruits, nuts, insects, birds, would have been found in the canopy. This climbing ability is unusual for a member of the genus Homo, as most species from Erectus onward had largely abandoned arboreal life in favor of full-time terrestrial walking, but it is not unprecedented. Australopithecus and early Homo both retained curved digits and other adaptations for climbing. And if luzonensis descended from an early offshoot of the genus that left Africa before Erectus, then these traits might simply be holdovers from an earlier time when tree climbing was still an important part of the hominin lifestyle. The small size of the teeth and the overall gracile build of the bones suggest that luzonensis, like floresiensis, was a small-bodied species, though exactly how small is impossible to say without more complete skeletal material. The curvature of the finger and toe bones is pronounced enough that some researchers have suggested luzonensis might have been even more arboreal than floresiensis, spending significant amounts of time in trees and possibly even nesting there, though this is speculative. What is clear is that luzonensis represents yet another example of island evolution producing unexpected forms, and that the diversity of human species in Southeast Asia during the Middle and Late Pleistocene was far greater than anyone had imagined before the discoveries of the past 2 decades. The fossil record for Homo luzonensis is frustratingly sparse. Only 13 bones have been found so far, all from Kalau Cave, and all dating to at least 67,000 years ago, though the layers above and below the fossils have not been as thoroughly excavated. So it is possible that luzonensis lived on Luzon for much longer. There is no evidence of stone tools directly associated with the fossils, which is puzzling, because the hands of luzonensis appear to have been capable of making and using tools, and other hominin species that lived during the same time period were all tool users. It is possible that luzonensis used tools made from organic materials, bamboo, wood, shell, that have not survived in the archaeological record, or that the tools they made were simple enough that they do not stand out as distinct from the background scatter of naturally fractured rocks that litter most caves. What happened to Homo luzonensis is unknown. The youngest fossils are 67,000 years old, which means the species could have gone extinct before Homo sapiens reached the Philippines, or it could have survived longer and eventually been outcompeted or absorbed when modern humans arrived sometime between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago. There is no genetic evidence of interbreeding between luzonensis and sapiens, which either means that the two species never met, or that they met but did not successfully interbreed, or that interbreeding did occur but the population that carried luzonensis genes went extinct before it could spread widely. The Philippines have been inhabited by modern humans for at least 40,000 years, and during that time sea levels have risen and fallen multiple times, submerging and exposing vast areas of land that are now underwater. It is possible that key archaeological sites that would shed light on the fate of luzonensis are now beneath the ocean, lost to rising seas at the end of the last ice age. What Homo luzonensis does reveal, regardless of its ultimate fate, is that island Southeast Asia during the late Pleistocene was home to at least 2 distinct small-bodied human species, and possibly more, each evolving in isolation on separate islands and adapting to local conditions in ways that produced strange and unexpected forms. The fact that these species existed at all challenges the old model of human evolution as a linear progression from primitive to advanced, from small-brained to large-brained, from Africa outward to the rest of the world. Instead, it suggests that human evolution was messy, branching, and full of parallel experiments, some of which succeeded for hundreds of thousands of years before eventually disappearing, leaving behind only fragments of bone and unanswered questions. For more than a century, the story of human evolution has been told as a story of brain expansion. Our ancestors began with brains no larger than those of modern chimpanzees, and over the course of 2 million years, through a process of gradual selection for intelligence, problem-solving ability, and social coordination, those brains grew larger and more complex until they reached the size and organization seen in modern humans. The narrative is simple and satisfying. Bigger brains meant smarter individuals survived better, and so natural selection favored those with the largest cranial capacities. Every textbook diagram of human evolution shows this progression, a neat sequence of skulls arranged from left to right, each one slightly larger than the last, culminating in Homo sapiens with its high forehead and rounded brain case. The implication is clear. Intelligence is what made us human, and intelligence required a big brain. The discovery of Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis shattered this narrative. Here were species with brains no larger than those of Australopithecines, 400 to 500 cubic centimeters, roughly the size of a grapefruit or a large orange. And yet they made stone tools, controlled fire, hunted or scavenged large animals, and survived for hundreds of thousands of years in environments that were far from easy. Floresiensis lived on an isolated island where resources were limited and predators, though smaller than on the mainland, were still present. Luzonensis climbed trees in tropical forests and somehow managed to cross open ocean to reach an island that had never been connected to the mainland. These were not simple, brutish creatures stumbling through life on instinct alone. They were behaviorally complex, adaptable, and successful by any measure that matters in evolutionary terms. The existence of these small-brained species forces a reconsideration of what brain size actually means. The traditional view holds that cognitive ability scales with brain size, at least within a given lineage, and that larger brains provide more processing power, more memory, and more capacity for abstract thought. This is true to a point. There is a correlation between brain size and certain measures of intelligence across mammalian species, but the correlation is not perfect, and there are enough exceptions that relying on brain size alone as a proxy for intelligence is clearly inadequate. Crows, for instance, have brains that weigh around 15 grams, a tiny fraction of a human brain, and yet they can solve multi-step puzzles, use tools, recognize individual human faces, and even hold grudges against people who have wronged them. Octopuses have brains that are distributed throughout their bodies rather than centralized in a single structure, and yet they demonstrate problem-solving abilities that rival those of many vertebrates, escaping from sealed containers, camouflaging themselves with astonishing precision, and learning through observation. What matters, it seems, is not the absolute size of the brain, but the organization of its neurons, the density of connections between different regions, and the efficiency with which information is processed. A small brain that is densely packed with neurons and wired efficiently can outperform a larger brain that is less well organized, and this principle appears to hold true across a wide range of species, from insects to birds to mammals. In the case of Floresiensis and Luzonensis, their small brains may have been more than sufficient for the cognitive demands of their environments, particularly if those brains were organized in ways that prioritized the specific skills they needed: manual dexterity for toolmaking, spatial awareness for navigating forests or coastlines, social coordination for group living. There is also the question of energy. Brains are metabolically expensive, consuming roughly 20% of the body's total energy budget in modern humans, despite making up only 2% of body mass. For a species living on an island with limited food resources, maintaining a large brain would be a significant burden, and natural selection would favor individuals who could survive and reproduce with smaller, more efficient brains that required less energy to maintain. This is one of the principles underlying island dwarfism. Bodies shrink because smaller individuals need less food, and there is no reason to think that brains would be exempt from this pressure. If a population of Homo erectus arrived on Flores with brains averaging 900 cubic centimeters and found themselves in an environment where food was scarce, those individuals with slightly smaller brains would have had a survival advantage, and over many generations, the average brain size of the population would decline. What is remarkable is that this reduction in brain size did not result in a loss of behavioral complexity, at least not to the point where Floresiensis could no longer make tools or survive in its environment. The stone tools found at Liangbua are not crude or primitive by the standards of the Middle Pleistocene. They are well-made implements that required planning, skill, and an understanding of how stone fractures. The ability to make such tools implies that Floresiensis had not only the manual dexterity necessary to strike flakes from a core, but also the cognitive capacity to visualize the final product, to plan the sequence of strikes, and to adjust the technique based on the properties of the stone being worked. These are not simple tasks, and they require a level of intelligence that goes well beyond what most people would expect from a brain the size of a chimpanzee's. The same can be said for Homo naledi, the small-brained species from South Africa, whose fossils were found deep within a cave system that would have been difficult and dangerous to navigate. Naledi had a brain of about 500 cubic centimeters, similar to Floresiensis, and yet the evidence suggests that they were deliberately placing bodies in the cave, possibly as a form of burial, or at least as a way of disposing of the dead that involved intentional behavior rather than simple abandonment. If this interpretation is correct, and it remains controversial, then Naledi was engaging in symbolic or ritualistic behavior, something that has traditionally been thought to require a large, complex brain capable of abstract thought. The fact that Naledi might have done this with a brain half the size of a modern human's is deeply puzzling and suggests that there is much about the relationship between brain size and cognitive ability that we do not yet understand. One possibility is that the cognitive abilities required for tool-making, fire use, and even symbolic thought are not as demanding as we have assumed, and that relatively small brains, if organized correctly, are perfectly capable of supporting these behaviors. Another possibility is that Floresiensis, Luzonensis, and Naledi inherited neural structures from their larger-brained ancestors that were already wired for these tasks, and that even as their brains shrank, the essential circuits remained intact, allowing them to continue making tools and behaving in complex ways despite the reduction in overall brain volume. This would be analogous to miniaturization in technology. Early computers filled entire rooms, but modern smartphones, which are vastly smaller, can perform far more complex tasks because of advances in the efficiency and organization of their components. There is also the question of what these species lost, if anything, when their brains shrank. It is possible that Floresiensis and Naledi were less capable than their larger-brained ancestors in certain domains. Perhaps they had smaller vocabularies if they possessed language. Perhaps their social groups were less complex. Perhaps their ability to plan far into the future was diminished. The fossil record cannot answer these questions because it preserves only bones and tools, not the thoughts and behaviors that defined these species in life. What is clear is that they were capable enough to survive for hundreds of thousands of years, which is a longer tenure than most species manage, and far longer than modern humans have yet existed. The small brain paradox, then, is not really a paradox at all once you abandon the idea that brain size is the primary determinant of intelligence. It is a reminder that evolution is not linear, that bigger is not always better, and that the specific pressures of a given environment can favor solutions that seem counterintuitive from the perspective of a species like ours, which has built its entire identity around the idea of being the smartest animal on the planet. Floresiensis, Luzonensis, and Naledi were not failures. They were successful adaptations to their respective environments, and the fact that they had small brains says more about our assumptions than it does about their capabilities. In September 2013, two recreational cavers exploring the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa squeezed through a narrow passage called the Dragon's Back, a vertical chute barely 18 centimeters wide at its narrowest point, and descended into a chamber that no modern human had ever entered. What they found there, scattered across the floor and embedded in the sediment, were bones, hundreds of them, possibly thousands, all belonging to an ancient hominin species that no one had seen before. The cavers took photographs and reported the discovery to Lee Berger, a paleoanthropologist at the University of the Witwatersrand who had been searching for hominin fossils in the area for years without much success. Berger assembled a team of scientists small and flexible enough to fit through the Dragon's Back, and over the next few weeks, they excavated more than 1,500 bones representing at least 15 individuals, making it one of the largest collections of hominin fossils ever found in a single location in Africa. The species was eventually named Homo naledi after the Sesotho word for star, in reference to the Rising Star Cave where the bones were discovered. The fossils presented a bewildering mix of features, some of which looked decidedly modern, while others appeared to be relics from much earlier stages of human evolution. The hands, for instance, were remarkably human-like, with curved fingers suited for climbing, but also with a thumb and wrist structure that would have allowed for the kind of precision grip needed to make and use stone tools. The feet were equally modern, with arches and toe proportions that indicated Naledi was a competent long-distance walker, capable of striding across open landscapes in much the same way that modern humans do. The shoulders and pelvis, however, were more primitive, with features that resembled those of Australopithecines, and the skull was small and low, with a brain that measured only about 500 cubic centimeters, roughly a third the size of a modern human brain and closer to the range seen in early Homo or even late Australopithecus. The initial assumption, based on the primitive features, was that Naledi was an ancient species, perhaps 2 or 3 million years old, a contemporary of Homo habilis or Australopithecus sediba. If that were true, then Naledi would represent an early experiment in the evolution of the genus Homo, a lineage that eventually went extinct without contributing to later human evolution. This interpretation, however, was overturned in 2017 when the bones were finally dated using a combination of radiometric techniques and analysis of the sediments in which they were found. The results were startling. Homo naledi had lived between 335,000 and 236,000 years ago, placing it squarely in the Middle Pleistocene and making it a contemporary of early Homo sapiens, late Homo heidelbergensis, and possibly even the last surviving populations of Homo erectus in Java. This meant that Naledi was not an ancient relic from the dawn of the human lineage, but a recent species that had somehow survived into a time when larger-brained humans were already widespread across Africa and beyond. The most perplexing aspect of the Rising Star discovery was not the fossils themselves, but the context in which they were found. The chamber where the bones lay, now called the Dinaledi Chamber, is located deep within the cave system, more than 30 meters below the surface, accessible only through a series of tight squeezes and vertical drops that would have been challenging even for experienced cavers with modern equipment. There is no evidence that the chamber was ever connected to the surface by a wider passage that might have allowed animals to fall in accidentally, and there are no bones from other species in the chamber. No carnivores, no herbivores, no scavengers of any kind. The only bones belong to Homo naledi, individuals of all ages from infants to elderly adults, and they are scattered across the floor in a way that suggests they were placed there deliberately rather than washed in by water or dragged in by predators. The most controversial interpretation of this evidence is that Homo naledi was disposing of its dead in the cave, intentionally carrying bodies into the dark, narrow passages and leaving them in the Dinaledi chamber as a form of burial or ritual behavior. If true, this would be extraordinary, because burial is generally thought to require a level of symbolic thinking and cultural complexity that should not be possible for a species with a brain the size of Naledi's. Modern humans bury their dead because we understand death as a concept, because we have beliefs about what happens after death, and because we care enough about our deceased companions to go through the effort of disposing of their bodies in a specific, culturally prescribed way. The idea that a small-brained hominin could do the same challenges fundamental assumptions about the relationship between brain size and cognitive complexity. There are alternative explanations. One possibility is that the Dinaledi chamber was not used for burial, but rather as a place where Naledi groups deposited bodies to keep them away from living areas, perhaps to avoid attracting scavengers or to prevent the spread of disease. Another possibility is that individuals who died in the cave were not carried there intentionally, but wandered in while still alive, became trapped, and died of dehydration or starvation. This would explain why the bones include individuals of all ages, but it raises the question of why so many individuals, over what appears to be an extended period of time, would make the same fatal mistake of entering a cave system that was clearly dangerous and difficult to navigate. The chamber is not easy to reach, and there is no obvious reason why Naledi would have been exploring it in the first place unless they were deliberately going there for some specific purpose. In 2022, new evidence emerged that complicated the picture even further. Researchers analyzing the cave walls in the Dinaledi chamber reported finding what appeared to be deliberate markings, geometric patterns scratched or carved into the soft limestone, along with evidence of controlled fire in the form of charred bone and soot deposits. If these findings are confirmed, and if they can be conclusively linked to Homo naledi rather than to later human activity, then it would suggest that Naledi was not only burying its dead, but also creating symbolic markings and using fire for purposes beyond simple warmth or cooking. The implications would be profound because it would mean that a species with a brain half the size of a modern human's was engaging in behaviors that have traditionally been considered markers of advanced cognition and culture. Skeptics have raised valid concerns about the interpretation of the evidence. The cave system has been visited by modern humans in recent centuries, and it is possible that some of the markings and fire evidence could be the result of later intrusions rather than the work of Naledi. The dating of the markings is not yet as secure as the dating of the bones, and until that uncertainty is resolved, conclusions about Naledi's symbolic behavior will remain tentative. Even the burial hypothesis, while compelling, is based on circumstantial evidence rather than direct proof, and there are still researchers who believe that natural processes, unusual as they might be, could account for the accumulation of bones in the Dinaledi chamber. What is not in dispute is that Homo naledi existed, that it lived recently enough to overlap with other human species, and that it had a brain that was remarkably small for a member of the genus Homo living in the Middle Pleistocene. Whether Naledi was capable of symbolic thought, whether it buried its dead, whether it used fire and created art, these questions remain open, and they are likely to be debated for years to come as new evidence is uncovered and new techniques for analyzing the fossils and the cave environment are developed. What Naledi does prove, regardless of how these debates are resolved, is that human evolution during the Middle Pleistocene was far more complex and varied than anyone imagined, and that small-brained species were not automatically consigned to the margins of existence, but could thrive, adapt, and perhaps even engage in behaviors that we have long assumed required a large, modern human brain. The mystery of Homo naledi is still unfolding, and the Rising Star Cave may yet yield more surprises. Additional excavations are planned, and researchers are now exploring other chambers within the cave system to see if more naledi remains can be found, possibly in contexts that will shed light on how they lived, what they ate, and how they interacted with their environment. For now, naledi stands as one of the most enigmatic members of the human family, a species that should not have existed when it did, in the form that it did, and yet somehow managed to carve out a place for itself in a world that was rapidly filling up with larger-brained, more cognitively advanced humans. How long it survived and what ultimately caused its extinction remains unknown. The fact that Homo floresiensis survived for at least 650,000 years on the island of Flores, and that Homo naledi persisted for at least 100,000 years in southern Africa, both with brains no larger than an orange, raises a question that cuts to the heart of what we think we know about human evolution. How did species with such small brains manage to survive for so long in a world that was increasingly dominated by larger-brained hominins? By the time Floresiensis and naledi were living, Homo heidelbergensis had already evolved brains averaging 1,200 cubic centimeters and was using sophisticated stone tools and controlling fire across much of Africa, Europe, and Western Asia. Homo erectus, with a brain of around 900 cubic centimeters, had been a successful and widespread species for more than 1 million years. Early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, both with brains approaching or exceeding 1,400 cubic centimeters, were beginning to emerge and expand into new territories. In this context, the persistence of small-brained species seems almost paradoxical, as if evolution were running two different experiments simultaneously, one favoring ever larger brains, and another demonstrating that large brains were not strictly necessary for long-term survival. The most straightforward explanation for the survival of Floresiensis is geographic isolation. Flores is an island separated from the Asian mainland and from neighboring islands by deep ocean channels that remained formidable barriers even during the ice ages when sea levels were at their lowest. This isolation meant that Floresiensis did not have to compete directly with larger-brained species like Homo erectus or Homo sapiens for resources, territory, or mates. The island had its own unique ecosystem, its own set of challenges and opportunities, and Floresiensis evolved to fit that specific environment. On Flores, being small was an advantage rather than a liability, because smaller bodies required less food, and food on the island was limited. The pygmy elephants that Floresiensis hunted or scavenged were themselves products of island dwarfism, and the entire ecosystem had adjusted to the constraints of insularity. As long as no larger-brained humans reached the island, Floresiensis could thrive in its niche without facing the kind of competitive pressure that might have driven it to extinction. The case of Homo naledi is more puzzling because southern Africa was not isolated in the way that Flores was. Naledi lived on a continent that was also home to Homo heidelbergensis and early Homo sapiens, both of which had larger brains and presumably more advanced cognitive abilities. Yet Naledi survived for at least 100,000 years, possibly longer, and seems to have coexisted with these other species without being immediately outcompeted. One possibility is that Naledi occupied a different ecological niche, one that did not overlap significantly with the territories or resource bases used by larger-brained hominins. The fact that Naledi fossils have been found only in cave systems, and in particular in deep, difficult-to-access chambers, suggests that this species may have been adapted to a specific kind of environment that other hominins avoided or could not exploit as effectively. Caves offer certain advantages as habitats, particularly in regions where surface temperatures fluctuate widely or where predators are a constant threat. They provide shelter from the elements, protection from large carnivores, and a relatively stable microclimate that does not vary as much as the open savanna or forest. If Naledi was spending significant amounts of time in caves, using them not just as temporary shelters, but as more permanent living spaces or as places to dispose of the dead, then it may have developed a suite of behaviors and adaptations that allowed it to thrive in subterranean environments where larger-brained species were less comfortable. The combination of climbing ability, as evidenced by the shoulder and hand anatomy, and the capacity for long-distance walking, as shown by the foot structure, would have made Naledi well suited to navigating the complex three-dimensional landscapes of cave systems, moving between the surface and the underground with ease. Another factor that may have contributed to the survival of small-brained species is the simple fact that brain size is not the only determinant of evolutionary fitness. Survival depends on a complex interplay of factors: body size, metabolic efficiency, reproductive rate, social structure, adaptability to environmental change, and sheer luck. A species with a small brain but a high reproductive rate, a flexible diet, and the ability to exploit marginal habitats might outcompete a larger-brained species that requires more resources, reproduces more slowly, and is less adaptable to changing conditions. In evolutionary terms, the question is not which species is smarter, but rather which species leaves the most descendants, and the answers to those two questions are not always the same. It is also worth considering that the cognitive abilities required for survival in most environments are not as demanding as we might assume from the perspective of a modern, technologically advanced species. For most of human evolution, the challenges faced by our ancestors were immediate and concrete: finding food, avoiding predators, maintaining social bonds, caring for offspring, navigating the landscape. These tasks require intelligence, to be sure, but they do not necessarily require the kind of abstract reasoning, long-term planning, or symbolic thought that characterize modern human cognition. A small brain that is well organized and efficiently wired might be perfectly adequate for meeting these challenges, particularly if the species in question has evolved behavioral strategies that compensate for any cognitive limitations. Tool use, for instance, does not require a massive brain. Crows make and use tools with brains that weigh less than 20 grams, and they do so without the benefit of hands or the kind of precision grip that allows primates to manipulate objects with fine control. If a crow can fashion a hook out of a piece of wire to retrieve food from a narrow tube, then there is no reason to think that a hominin with a 500 cubic centimeter brain and human-like hands could not make a perfectly serviceable stone tool. The fact that Homo naledi and Homo floresiensis had hands that were capable of precision grip suggests that tool-making was well within their abilities, even if they were not producing the kind of complex, regionally varied toolkits that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were making during the same period. Fire use, similarly, does not require advanced cognition once the basic techniques have been learned. Controlling fire is largely a matter of understanding how to maintain it, feeding it with fuel, protecting it from wind and rain, moving it from place to place, and these are skills that can be passed down through observation and imitation without the need for complex language or abstract instruction. If Homo erectus was controlling fire 800,000 years ago with a brain smaller than that of Neanderthals or Homo sapiens, then there is no reason to think that Naledi or Floresiensis could not have done the same, assuming they had access to the necessary materials and the knowledge of how to use them. What small-brained species may have lacked, and what eventually may have contributed to their extinction, is the kind of cognitive flexibility and innovation that allowed larger-brained species to adapt to rapidly changing environments. The period between 300,000 and 40,000 years ago was marked by significant climatic instability, with ice ages and warm interglacials alternating in cycles that lasted tens of thousands of years. Each shift in climate brought changes in vegetation, animal populations, and the availability of water and other resources, and species that could not adapt quickly were at risk of extinction. Homo sapiens, with its large brain, complex social structures, and capacity for symbolic thought, was able to develop new technologies, new hunting strategies, and new ways of organizing society in response to these changes. Neanderthals, despite their large brains, were less flexible and eventually went extinct as the climate shifted and Homo sapiens expanded into their territories. For Homo naledi and Homo floresiensis, the lack of cognitive flexibility may have been the limiting factor. If these species were well adapted to specific environments, naledi to caves, floresiensis to islands, then they might have thrived as long as those environments remained stable. When the environment changed, however, they would have had fewer options for adapting, and if the change was severe enough, extinction would have been the inevitable result. This is speculative, of course, because the fossil record does not preserve behavior or cognition, only bones and tools. But it is consistent with what we know about the fate of specialist species in the face of environmental upheaval. The survival question then has no single answer. Homo floresiensis survived because it was isolated on an island where it faced little competition. Homo naledi may have survived because it occupied a niche that larger-brained species did not exploit. Both species demonstrated that small brains were not an insurmountable obstacle to long-term survival, at least under certain conditions. What they could not do ultimately was compete with the cognitive flexibility and adaptability of Homo sapiens, a species that was not constrained by any single environment or way of life, and that could reinvent itself as many times as necessary to survive whatever the planet threw at it. For most of the 20th century, the prevailing view of human evolution held that Homo sapiens evolved in Africa and then spread outward across the globe, replacing all other human species without interbreeding with them. This theory, known as the recent African origin model or the out of Africa hypothesis, was supported by fossil evidence showing that the earliest anatomically modern humans appeared in Africa around 300,000 years ago, and by mitochondrial DNA studies in the 1980s that traced all living humans back to a common female ancestor who lived in Africa sometime between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. The model was clean, straightforward, and easy to visualize. Modern humans emerged in one place, migrated out, and everywhere they went, they outcompeted the archaic humans they encountered, eventually becoming the sole surviving species of the genus Homo. The problem with this model, as elegant as it was, is that it turned out to be wrong, or at least incomplete. The first cracks in the theory appeared in 2010, when researchers sequencing the Neanderthal genome discovered something unexpected in the data. When they compared the Neanderthal DNA to the genomes of living humans from different populations around the world, they found that non-African populations, Europeans, Asians, Native Americans, Australians, all carried small amounts of Neanderthal DNA, typically between 1% and 4% of their total genome, while sub-Saharan Africans carried little to none. The only plausible explanation for this pattern was that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals had interbred at some point in the past, most likely in the Middle East or Southern Europe, after Homo sapiens had left Africa, but before the populations had spread out across the rest of the world. The interbreeding was not extensive, and it probably involved only a few encounters over a period of several thousand years, but it was enough to leave a permanent genetic signature in the genomes of billions of people alive today. The discovery that modern humans carried Neanderthal DNA was revolutionary, but it was only the beginning. When scientists sequenced the genome of the Denisovan fingerbone from Siberia, they found that Denisovan DNA was present in modern human populations as well, though the distribution was different from that of Neanderthal DNA. Melanesians, Aboriginal Australians, and some populations in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands carried between 4 and 6% Denisovan DNA, a proportion significantly higher than the Neanderthal contribution found in Europeans and Asians. This meant that as Homo sapiens migrated eastward through Asia, they encountered Denisovan populations and interbred with them, just as earlier groups had interbred with Neanderthals in the West. The fact that Melanesians carried more Denisovan DNA than any other modern population suggested that the interbreeding had been more extensive in Southeast Asia and Oceania, possibly because Denisovan populations were more numerous there, or because the encounters occurred over a longer period of time. Further analysis of the Denisovan genome revealed something even more surprising. The Denisovans themselves appeared to be hybrids, carrying DNA not only from their own lineage, but also from Neanderthals and from at least one other as yet unidentified archaic human species that diverged from the main line of Homo evolution even earlier. This unknown species, sometimes referred to as a super-archaic or ghost population, may have been a late surviving group of Homo erectus or a descendant of Heidelbergensis that had remained isolated in Eastern Asia while the rest of the human world moved on. Whoever they were, they interbred with the Denisovans, and through the Denisovans, traces of their DNA made it into modern human populations, particularly in Melanesia and Australia. This meant that people living today carry genetic material from species that are not even represented in the fossil record, lineages that we know about only because their DNA survives in diluted form, mixed and remixed over tens of thousands of years. The pattern of interbreeding was not limited to encounters between Homo sapiens and archaic humans. The genomes of both Neanderthals and Denisovans show evidence of interbreeding with each other. And in 2018, researchers announced the discovery of a bone fragment from Denisova Cave that belonged to a teenage girl whose mother was a Neanderthal and whose father was a Denisovan. This so-called first-generation hybrid confirmed that interbreeding between different human species was not a rare or accidental event, but something that happened regularly whenever populations encountered one another. The girl's existence also suggested that hybrids were viable and possibly even fertile, meaning that the genetic boundaries between species were far more permeable than the traditional biological definition of species would suggest. Even within Africa, where Homo sapiens first evolved, the genetic evidence points to a history of interbreeding with archaic populations. Studies of modern African genomes have detected segments of DNA that do not match any known hominin lineage and that appear to have been introduced through interbreeding with populations that diverged from the ancestors of Homo sapiens hundreds of thousands of years ago. These ghost populations have not yet been identified in the fossil record, though Homo naledi, with its recent dates and its presence in southern Africa, is a potential candidate. If Naledi did interbreed with early Homo sapiens, it would help explain some of the genetic diversity seen in modern African populations, though proving this will require extracting DNA from Naledi fossils, which has not yet been successful due to the poor preservation of genetic material in warm, tropical climates. The genes that modern humans inherited from Neanderthals and Denisovans are not randomly distributed across the genome, and they are not simply remnants of ancient encounters that serve no function. Many of the archaic genes that have survived in modern populations are concentrated in regions of the genome that affect the immune system, skin and hair traits, and metabolism. This suggests that these genes were actively selected for because they provided advantages to Homo sapiens populations as they moved into new environments and encountered new diseases. Neanderthals, who had been living in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, had evolved immune systems that were adapted to the pathogens present in those regions, and when Homo sapiens arrived and interbred with them, some of those immune genes were passed on. Modern humans of European and Asian descent carry Neanderthal versions of genes in the HLA complex, which plays a critical role in recognizing and responding to infections. And these genes have been shown to provide enhanced resistance to certain viruses and bacteria. Similarly, the EPAS1 gene variant that modern Tibetans inherited from Denisovans helps the body process oxygen more efficiently at high altitudes, reducing the risk of altitude sickness and allowing people to live and work in environments where most humans would struggle. This gene variant is almost entirely absent in lowland populations, which suggests that it was strongly selected for in the highlands of Tibet, and that the people who carried it had a significant survival advantage over those who did not. In Melanesia and Australia, Denisovan genes have been linked to immune function and possibly to adaptations related to diving and breath-holding, though the evidence for the latter is still tentative and requires further study. The fact that archaic genes provided adaptive advantages is consistent with a broader understanding of how evolution works. When populations move into new environments, they face selective pressures that favor certain traits over others, and any source of genetic variation that helps individuals cope with those pressures will be favored by natural selection. Interbreeding with archaic humans who had already been living in those environments for hundreds of thousands of years provided a shortcut to adaptation, allowing Homo sapiens to acquire beneficial genes in a single generation rather than waiting for those genes to evolve independently over many thousands of years. This process, known as adaptive introgression, is well documented in other species, from wolves and coyotes to Darwin's finches, and it appears to have played a significant role in the evolutionary success of Homo sapiens. The overall picture that emerges from the genetic data is one of a species that was not pure or isolated, but deeply interconnected with other human lineages through a web of interbreeding events that spanned continents and tens of thousands of years. The boundaries between species were not rigid walls but permeable membranes, and the encounters between different groups of humans were not always hostile or competitive. Sometimes they were cooperative, or at least neutral enough that interbreeding could occur, and that the resulting hybrid offspring could survive, reproduce, and pass on their mixed genetic heritage to future generations. The idea that Homo sapiens replaced other human species through simple competitive exclusion is too simplistic. What actually happened was more complex, more gradual, and far messier than the old models allowed. We did not simply replace the Neanderthals and Denisovans. We absorbed them, and in doing so, we became something new. A hybrid species carrying the genetic legacy of multiple lineages, a mosaic of the human family tree rather than a single unbranched line. Around 40,000 years ago, something began to change. The world, which for hundreds of thousands of years had been home to multiple human species living in different regions and occasionally encountering one another, started to empty out. The Neanderthals, who had dominated Europe and Western Asia for more than 300,000 years, began to disappear from their traditional territories, their populations contracting into smaller and smaller refuges in southern Spain, the Balkans, and the Caucasus. The Denisovans, whose range had once stretched from Siberia to Southeast Asia and possibly beyond, left no fossils dated to less than 40,000 years ago, suggesting that they too were in decline. Homo floresiensis, which had survived on the island of Flores for hundreds of thousands of years, vanished from the fossil record around 50,000 years ago, though some evidence suggests they may have lingered slightly longer. By 30,000 years ago, and certainly by 10,000 years ago, only one human species remained, Homo sapiens, spread across every continent except Antarctica, the sole survivor of a genus that had once been remarkably diverse. The extinction of the Neanderthals is the best documented of these disappearances. partly because Neanderthals left behind a rich fossil record, and partly because their last populations overlapped geographically and temporally with Homo sapiens, creating a situation where both species were present in the same regions at the same time, and where their interactions, or lack thereof, can be traced through archaeology. The final Neanderthal populations are found in sites scattered across southern Europe, the last dated to around 39,000 years ago in caves in Gibraltar and the Iberian Peninsula. These late Neanderthals were living in small, isolated groups, separated from one another by mountain ranges and stretches of inhospitable terrain, and the archaeological evidence suggests that their populations were fragmentary, and possibly in decline even before Homo sapiens arrived in large numbers. Why the Neanderthals disappeared is a question that has been debated for more than a century, and the answer is almost certainly not a single factor, but a combination of pressures that worked together to push an already vulnerable population past the point of recovery. Climate change was one such pressure. The period between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago was marked by significant climatic instability, with rapid fluctuations between warm and cold phases that would have disrupted ecosystems and forced both human and animal populations to adapt quickly or relocate. Neanderthals, who were specialized for life in cold, glacial environments, may have struggled to cope with the warming periods, which would have shifted the distribution of the large herbivores they hunted and altered the availability of plant foods and water sources. Competition with Homo sapiens was another factor, though exactly how this competition played out is difficult to determine from the archaeological record alone. Homo sapiens populations entering Europe brought with them more diverse toolkits, more sophisticated hunting strategies, and possibly larger and more complex social networks that allowed them to coordinate activities over greater distances and share resources more efficiently. If Homo sapiens was more effective at hunting the same prey that Neanderthals relied on, or if they were better at exploiting seasonal resources and storing food for lean periods, then they would have had a competitive edge that could gradually erode Neanderthal populations even without direct conflict. There is no clear evidence of warfare or mass killings between the two species, which suggests that the replacement was not a matter of one group violently displacing the other, but rather a slower process of demographic attrition, where Homo sapiens populations grew while Neanderthal populations shrank. Disease may also have played a role, though this is one of the most speculative aspects of the extinction debate because diseases leave no direct traces in the fossil record. When populations that have been isolated for hundreds of thousands of years come into contact, the exchange of pathogens can be devastating, as history has shown repeatedly with the introduction of European diseases to indigenous populations in the Americas and the Pacific. If Homo sapiens carried diseases to which Neanderthals had no immunity, then even sporadic contact could have triggered epidemics that reduced Neanderthal numbers and weakened their ability to recover from other pressures. The fact that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interbred suggests that they were in close enough contact for disease transmission to occur, though proving that this actually happened and that it contributed significantly to Neanderthal extinction remains beyond the reach of current evidence. The final factor, and perhaps the most important, was absorption. The genetic data shows that Neanderthals did not simply vanish. They were integrated into the expanding Homo sapiens population through interbreeding. As Neanderthal populations shrank and became more fragmented, the likelihood increased that any encounter with Homo sapiens would result in interbreeding rather than competition, and over time, the small, isolated Neanderthal groups would have been genetically swamped by the much larger Homo sapiens population. This process, sometimes called genetic assimilation, does not require violence or even direct competition. It is simply a matter of numbers. When a small population interbreeds with a much larger one, the genes of the small population are diluted and eventually absorbed into the larger gene pool, and after a few generations, there are no individuals left who are genetically distinct enough to be called members of the original species. The disappearance of the Denisovans follows a similar timeline, though the details are much harder to trace because the fossil record is so sparse. The youngest Denisovan remains date to around 40,000 years ago, and there is no evidence that the species survived beyond that point, though the genetic data suggests that Denisovan populations were widespread across Asia, and that they may have persisted in some regions longer than in others. Like the Neanderthals, the Denisovans interbred with Homo sapiens, and their genes survive in modern populations, particularly in Melanesia and Tibet, where the adaptive advantages provided by Denisovan DNA were strong enough that those genes were actively selected for. The fact that Denisovan DNA is present in such geographically distant populations suggests that the encounters between Denisovans and Homo sapiens were not isolated events, but part of a broader pattern of contact and gene flow that occurred as Homo sapiens spread across Asia. Homo floresiensis, isolated on the island of Flores, may have survived longer than the Neanderthals or Denisovans, depending on how the dating evidence is interpreted. The youngest fossils are around 60,000 years old, but stone tools that resemble those made by Floresiensis have been found in layers dated to 50,000 years ago, and some researchers have argued that the species may have persisted until as recently as 12,000 years ago, based on local oral traditions and reports of small-bodied, human-like creatures in the historical record. If Floresiensis did survive into the Holocene, then it would have been the last non-sapiens human species to go extinct, disappearing only a few thousand years before the rise of agriculture and civilization. Whether its extinction was caused by the arrival of Homo sapiens on Flores, by volcanic eruptions, by climate change, or by some combination of factors, remains unknown. Homo naledi presents yet another mystery. The youngest Naledi fossils are dated to around 236,000 years ago, which places the species firmly in the Middle Pleistocene. But the lack of more recent fossils does not necessarily mean that Naledi went extinct at that time. The fossil record is notoriously incomplete, and it is entirely possible that Naledi survived much longer, particularly if it was living in cave environments that are underrepresented in the archaeological record or in regions that have not been as intensively surveyed. Until more fossils are found, or until DNA can be extracted from the existing remains, the question of when Naledi disappeared will remain open. What is clear from all of this is that the period between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago was a critical turning point in human history, a time when the diversity that had characterized the genus Homo for 2 million years collapsed down to a single species. The reasons for this collapse were complex and varied depending on the species and the region, but the common thread was the expansion of Homo sapiens. Whether through competition, disease, climate change, or absorption, every other human species that encountered Homo sapiens eventually disappeared, leaving behind only traces in the fossil record and fragments of DNA that survive in the genomes of people living today. The Great Vanishing was not a sudden event, not a catastrophe that wiped out multiple species in a single generation. It was a gradual process that unfolded over tens of thousands of years, and by the time it was over, the world looked fundamentally different than it had at any point in the previous 2 million years. For the first time since the genus Homo emerged, there was only one kind of human left. The question of why Homo sapiens survived when every other human species went extinct is one of the most fundamental puzzles in the study of human evolution, and it is also one of the most difficult to answer with certainty. On the surface, there is nothing about Homo sapiens that seems obviously superior to the other human species that were alive 300,000 years ago. Our brains, averaging around 1,400 cubic centimeters, were not the largest. Neanderthals had brains that were on average 100 cubic centimeters larger, and yet they went extinct while we survived. We were not the strongest. Neanderthals were more robustly built, with thicker bones and greater muscle mass, adaptations that would have made them formidable in hand-to-hand combat or in subduing large prey. We were not the most cold adapted. Again, that distinction belongs to the Neanderthals, whose stocky bodies and large nasal passages were specifically evolved for life in glacial Europe. We were not even the only species capable of symbolic thought, tool-making, fire control, or cooperative hunting, as the archaeological evidence from Neanderthals, Denisovans, and possibly even Homo naledi makes clear. What Homo sapiens did have, and what may ultimately explain our success, was a combination of traits that together created a kind of cognitive and behavioral flexibility that other species lacked. The first of these traits was language, or more precisely, a form of language that was more complex, more recursive, and more capable of conveying abstract ideas than whatever forms of communication the Neanderthals or Denisovans possessed. The evidence for this is indirect, because language does not fossilize, but it is supported by anatomical features such as the shape of the vocal tract and the presence of the FOXP2 gene in its modern form, as well as by the archaeological record, which shows that Homo sapiens was producing art, jewelry, and symbolic objects far earlier and in far greater variety than any other species. Language would have allowed Homo sapiens groups to coordinate activities over larger areas, to share information about resources and dangers more efficiently, and to transmit cultural knowledge from one generation to the next with greater fidelity. Social organization was another key factor. While Neanderthals lived in small groups, probably numbering no more than 30 to 50 individuals, and while their social networks appear to have been relatively localized, Homo sapiens developed larger and more interconnected social structures that allowed for trade, alliance building, and the exchange of mates across considerable distances. Evidence for long-distance trade networks appears in the archaeological record as early as 100,000 years ago, with stone tools made from raw materials that were sourced from quarries hundreds of kilometers away, and with shells and other ornamental objects that clearly traveled long distances from their points of origin. These networks would have provided Homo sapiens with access to a wider range of resources, greater genetic diversity through intermarriage with distant groups, and the ability to call on allies in times of scarcity or conflict. Innovation and adaptability were also critical. Homo sapiens populations showed a remarkable capacity for developing new technologies and new strategies in response to changing environmental conditions. When large game became scarce, they switched to fishing, shellfish gathering, and the hunting of smaller, faster prey. When stone suitable for toolmaking was unavailable, they used bone, antler, wood, and other materials. When the climate shifted and traditional food sources disappeared, they moved to new territories and adapted their subsistence strategies to whatever resources were available. This behavioral flexibility stands in contrast to the more conservative tool traditions of Neanderthals, whose Mousterian toolkit remained largely unchanged for tens of thousands of years, and to the specialized adaptations of species like Homo floresiensis, which thrived in one specific environment but could not adjust when that environment changed. There is also the possibility that Homo sapiens had an advantage in terms of population size and reproductive rate. Larger populations are more resilient in the face of environmental shocks, disease outbreaks, and competition with other species because they can absorb losses and still maintain viable breeding populations. If Homo sapiens groups were larger and more densely packed than Neanderthal or Denisovan groups, and if they reproduced more quickly, then even if individual Homo sapiens were not necessarily smarter or more capable than individual Neanderthals, the sheer weight of numbers would eventually tip the balance in favor of Homo sapiens. This is especially true in a scenario where interbreeding was occurring, because the genes of the smaller population would be diluted and absorbed into the larger one, a process that does not require any competitive advantage on the part of Homo sapiens other than being more numerous. What Homo sapiens was not, despite popular narratives to the contrary, was a species that succeeded through violence or deliberate genocide. There is no archaeological evidence of mass killings, no sites where Neanderthal bones show signs of systematic violence by Homo sapiens, and no indication that the extinction of other human species was the result of warfare. The replacement was almost certainly more subtle and more gradual, playing out over thousands of years through a combination of competition for resources, demographic swamping through interbreeding, and the slow erosion of already small and fragmented populations. In some cases, extinction may have been less about Homo sapiens actively driving other species to extinction, and more about those species being unable to adapt to the same environmental changes that Homo sapiens was navigating successfully. By around 30,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was the last human species standing, and the planet entered a phase that had no precedent in the previous 2 million years of hominin evolution. A world with only one kind of human. This was not a triumph in any moral sense, because evolution does not reward virtue or punish failure. It was simply an outcome, the result of a complex interplay of genetics, behavior, environment, and chance. Homo sapiens survived not because we were destined to survive, not because we were inherently superior, but because we happened to have the right combination of traits at the right time to navigate the challenges of the late Pleistocene without going extinct. The cost of this survival, however, was a dramatic loss of diversity. When Homo erectus, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, and the various ghost populations disappeared, humanity lost an enormous range of physical forms, cognitive styles, cultural traditions, and adaptive strategies. The genus Homo, which had once included species that ranged from 1 meter tall to nearly 2 meters, from brains of 400 cubic centimeters to 1,500 cubic centimeters, from tropical islands to Arctic tundra, from tree climbers to endurance runners, was now reduced to a single species with a relatively narrow range of variation. Genetic diversity within Homo sapiens is remarkably low compared to other large mammal species, a consequence of population bottlenecks and the fact that all living humans are descended from a relatively small founding population that left Africa sometime between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago. This lack of diversity has implications that extend into the present. Low genetic diversity makes a species more vulnerable to diseases, environmental changes, and other threats, because there is less raw material for natural selection to work with when conditions change. The fact that all non-African humans carry Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA is a small counterbalance to this, adding genetic variation that might not otherwise exist, but it is not enough to make up for the loss of the entire spectrum of human diversity that existed 300,000 years ago. We are, in a very real sense, a genetically impoverished species, surviving not because we are robust and diverse, but because we have been lucky enough, so far, to avoid the kinds of catastrophic events that would expose our vulnerabilities. The other cost of being the sole survivor is a kind of existential loneliness. For almost 2 million years, the genus Homo was never alone on the planet. There were always other kinds of humans somewhere in the world, living their own lives, adapting to their own environments, experimenting with their own solutions to the problem of survival. The presence of these other species meant that humanity was plural, that there were multiple ways of being human, and that the path of evolution had not yet narrowed to a single outcome. Now, for the first time in the history of the genus, there is only one answer to the question, what does it mean to be human? And that answer is us. We are the sole inheritors of a lineage that once held far more possibilities, and whether we use that inheritance wisely or squander it remains to be seen. The Neanderthals and Denisovans are not extinct in the way that most people imagine extinction. They did not vanish completely from the Earth, leaving behind only fossils and stone tools as evidence that they once existed. Instead, they left something far more intimate and enduring, fragments of their genomes woven into the DNA of nearly every person alive today who has ancestry outside of sub-Saharan Africa. These fragments are not passive relics, not junk DNA carried along as evolutionary baggage. Many of them are functional genes that continue to influence human biology in measurable ways, affecting everything from immune responses to skin pigmentation, from altitude adaptation to the risk of certain diseases. The ghosts of extinct human species are not haunting ancient caves or crumbling bones. They are living inside us, active and influential, shaping the way our bodies respond to the world. The Neanderthal contribution is the most widespread and the best studied. Roughly 1 to 4% of the genome of people with European, Asian, or Native American ancestry comes from Neanderthals, a proportion that seems small but represents millions of base pairs of DNA distributed across thousands of genes. These Neanderthal-derived sequences are not evenly spread across the genome. They are concentrated in certain regions, particularly those related to the immune system, skin and hair traits, and metabolism. The HLA genes, which are part of the major histocompatibility complex and play a critical role in recognizing pathogens and mounting immune responses, include several variants that were inherited from Neanderthals and that are now common in modern human populations. One of these variants, HLA-A*02, is present in more than half of all Europeans and provides enhanced resistance to certain viral infections, a clear example of how Neanderthal genes have contributed to the survival of their descendants. Skin and hair traits are another area where Neanderthal ancestry has left a visible mark. Genes affecting skin color, hair texture, and the tendency to develop freckles all show evidence of Neanderthal introgression, and in some cases, these Neanderthal-derived variants are associated with lighter skin tones and red hair, traits that would have been advantageous in the low-light environments of Northern Europe, where vitamin D synthesis through the skin is less efficient. The fact that these traits are more common in populations that have been living in northern latitudes for tens of thousands of years suggests that the Neanderthal genes were actively selected for because they helped Homo sapiens adapt to environments where their African ancestors had never lived. Metabolism and fat storage are also influenced by Neanderthal genes, particularly in relation to how the body processes lipids and responds to cold stress. Some of the Neanderthal-derived genetic variants found in modern Europeans affect the distribution of body fat and the efficiency with which the body converts food into energy during periods of scarcity or extreme cold. These variants would have been advantageous during the Ice Age, when temperatures were much lower than they are today, and when the ability to survive on limited food resources during the winter months could mean the difference between life and death. The irony is that some of these same genetic variants, which were beneficial in a cold, resource-scarce environment, are now associated with an increased risk of metabolic disorders such as type 2 diabetes and obesity in modern populations living sedentary lifestyles with abundant food. The Denisovan genetic legacy is smaller in terms of the number of people who carry it, but in some populations, the contribution is even larger than the Neanderthal contribution. Melanesians, Aboriginal Australians, and some Southeast Asian groups carry between 4 and 6% Denisovan DNA. And in the case of Tibetans and Sherpas, a single Denisovan gene has had a transformative effect on their ability to live at high altitudes. The EPAS1 gene, which regulates the production of red blood cells in response to low oxygen levels, exists in a variant form in Tibetans that is almost never found in lowland populations. This variant allows the body to maintain normal oxygen levels in the blood without producing an excessive number of red blood cells, which at high altitudes can lead to thickened blood, increased risk of stroke, and a condition called chronic mountain sickness. The presence of this gene in Tibetans, and the fact that it is derived from Denisovans who lived in the same highland regions tens of thousands of years ago, is one of the clearest examples of adaptive introgression, a case where interbreeding with an archaic human species provided an immediate and measurable survival advantage. Other Denisovan genes have been linked to immune function, though the specific mechanisms and advantages are still being worked out. Some researchers have also suggested that Denisovan-derived genes may be related to the exceptional diving abilities of the Bajau people of the Philippines, who can hold their breath for extended periods while free-diving to depths of more than 70 meters to hunt fish. The genetic evidence for this is preliminary and requires more study, but if it holds up, it would represent another example of how archaic human DNA has contributed to the remarkable diversity of human adaptations seen today. Even within Africa, where Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA is largely absent, there is evidence of introgression from other archaic human populations. Genetic studies have identified segments of DNA in modern African populations that do not match any known hominin lineage, and that appear to have been introduced through interbreeding with populations that diverged from the ancestors of Homo sapiens hundreds of thousands of years ago. These ghost populations, as they are sometimes called, have not yet been matched to any fossils, though candidates include Homo naledi, or late surviving descendants of Homo heidelbergensis that remained isolated in certain parts of Africa. The fact that these archaic genes are still present in modern African genomes suggests that interbreeding was not a rare event limited to the encounters between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals in Europe and Asia, but rather a recurring pattern throughout human evolution, one that provided genetic variation and allowed populations to adapt more quickly to changing environments. The functional significance of these archaic genes extends beyond individual traits and has implications for understanding human health and disease. Some Neanderthal-derived genes have been associated with an increased risk of autoimmune disorders, depression, and other conditions that are common in modern populations, while others appear to provide protection against certain infections or enhance the body's ability to cope with environmental stresses. The fact that the same genetic variant can be beneficial in one context and harmful in another is a reminder that evolution does not optimize for long-term health or well-being. It optimizes for reproductive success under the specific conditions in which a population is living. A gene that helped Neanderthals survive in Ice Age Europe may have unintended consequences in modern humans living in heated homes, eating processed foods, and facing stresses that did not exist 40,000 years ago. The presence of archaic DNA in modern human genomes also complicates the question of what it means to be Homo sapiens. If every person of non-African descent carries Neanderthal genes, and if Melanesians carry Denisovan genes, and if Africans carry genes from unknown archaic populations, then the idea of a pure, uncontaminated Homo sapiens lineage is a myth. We are all hybrids, carrying genetic material from multiple human species, and the boundaries between those species were never as rigid as the Linnaean system of classification would suggest. The fact that Neanderthals and Denisovans could interbreed with Homo sapiens and produce fertile offspring means that the reproductive isolation that typically defines separate species was incomplete, and that the divergence between these lineages, while real, was not absolute. This realization has profound implications for how we think about human evolution and human identity. The story is not one of a single, superior species emerging from Africa and conquering the world, but rather one of contact, exchange, hybridization, and mutual influence. The Neanderthals and Denisovans did not disappear, they transformed, their genes persisting in diluted form but still active, still shaping the biology of their descendants. In this sense, they are not truly extinct, they are still here, encoded in the cells of billions of people, a permanent and ineradicable part of what it means to be human. The ghosts in our DNA are not phantoms, they are ancestors, and their legacy is written not in stone or bone, but in the living, breathing bodies of everyone who carries their genes. 300,000 years ago, the world was crowded in a way that it will never be again. Not crowded with billions of individuals of a single species, as it is today, but crowded with diversity, with different kinds of humans occupying different corners of the planet, each adapted to their own environment, each solving the problem of survival in their own way. In Europe, the ancestors of the Neanderthals were refining their mastery of Ice Age landscapes, learning to hunt woolly mammoths and build shelters from mammoth bones and hide. In Africa, early Homo sapiens was beginning to emerge from its Heidelbergensis ancestry, experimenting with new tools and new ways of organizing social life. In Asia, the Denisovans were adapting to extremes, some populations evolving to thrive in the thin air of the Tibetan highlands, while others spread south into warmer regions. On the island of Flores, a population of tiny humans was hunting pygmy elephants and navigating a world where being small was an advantage. In the caves of southern Africa, Homo naledi was doing something mysterious with its dead, carrying bodies into deep chambers for reasons we may never fully understand. These were not failed experiments or evolutionary dead ends. They were successful species, each with hundreds of thousands of years of survival behind them, each with their own cultures, their own traditions, their own ways of understanding the world. They made tools, controlled fire, cared for their young, buried their dead. They looked up at the same stars, felt the same sun on their skin, experienced hunger and cold and fear and wonder. They were human in every way that mattered, even if their bodies and brains were different from ours. The fact that they are gone now does not diminish what they were. It only reminds us that survival is not a measure of worth and that extinction is not a verdict on failure. The story of the Nine is also a story of loss. When Homo erectus disappeared from Java, when the last Neanderthals died in their caves in Gibraltar, when Homo floresiensis vanished from Flores, the world became a little less diverse, a little less interesting, a little more uniform. Each extinction removed a branch from the human family tree, a possibility that will never be explored again, a way of being human that is now lost to time. The genetic diversity that modern humans carry is a pale shadow of what existed when the genus Homo was at its peak. And the cultural diversity, the different languages, the different ways of making tools, the different approaches to art and ritual and social organization, is entirely gone, except for the faint echoes preserved in stone and bone. What we have learned from the discovery of these other human species is that evolution is not a ladder but a bush, thick and tangled, with branches growing in unexpected directions, some thriving for a time before being pruned away, others persisting long enough to give rise to new branches. Human evolution was never destined to produce Homo sapiens. It could have gone 100 different ways, and in some of those alternate histories, the Neanderthals might have survived while we did not, or the Denisovans might have become the dominant species, or the world might still be home to multiple human lineages living side by side. The fact that only one branch survived is a result of contingency, of chance events and environmental pressures that could easily have played out differently. We are not here because we were the best. We are here because we were lucky. The questions that remain are larger than any single species. If brain size is not the only measure of intelligence, then what is? If small-brained species like Homo floresiensis and Homo naledi could survive for hundreds of thousands of years, make tools, control fire, and possibly even engage in symbolic thought, then what does that say about the relationship between cognition and brain structure? If interbreeding between different human species was common and beneficial, providing adaptive genes that are still active in modern populations, then what does that tell us about the boundaries between species and the nature of human identity? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are questions that touch on fundamental aspects of biology, evolution, and what it means to be human. The implications extend into the present and the future. Homo sapiens is now the sole representative of the genus Homo, and we have been alone for more than 10,000 years, a period that represents only a tiny fraction of the 2 million-year history of our lineage. In that time, we have built civilizations, developed agriculture, created art and literature and science, and transformed the planet in ways that no other species ever has. We have also driven countless other species to extinction, altered the climate, and created technologies that could, if misused, threaten our own survival. The fact that we are the last humans left does not mean we are immune to extinction. It means that if we disappear, there will be no other human species to take our place, no other branch of the family tree waiting in the wings. The experiment will be over. Perhaps that is the most important lesson from the story of the Nine. Diversity is not just an abstract good, it is a buffer against catastrophe, a hedge against the unpredictable future. When there were multiple human species, the extinction of one did not mean the end of the human story. There were others living in different places, adapted to different conditions, who could carry on. Now there is only us, and if we fail, there is no backup plan. The loss of the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, and all the others has left us genetically impoverished and existentially isolated, the sole inheritors of a lineage that once held far more possibilities. And yet, they are not entirely gone. In the DNA of every person alive today who has ancestry outside of Africa, Neanderthal genes persist, silent but active, influencing immune responses and skin color and countless other traits. In the highlands of Tibet, Denisovan genes help people breathe in thin air, a gift from a species that disappeared 40,000 years ago. In Africa, ghost populations that we have not yet identified left their mark on the genomes of modern humans, contributing to the genetic diversity that allowed our species to survive and spread. The ghosts are still here, woven into the fabric of our biology, a reminder that we are not a single, pure lineage but a composite, a mixture of multiple human species that once walked the earth under the same sky. 300,000 years ago, if you had stood on a hill and looked out across the landscape, you might have seen smoke rising from a Neanderthal camp in the distance, or heard the sounds of Homo naledi moving through a nearby cave system, or glimpsed the small figure of Homo floresiensis disappearing into the forest. The world was full of humans, plural, and the future was open, unwritten, full of possibilities. Now, when you stand on that same hill, there is only one kind of human left, and the smoke you see comes from cities and factories, and the sounds you hear are the hum of machines and the chatter of a single species talking to itself. The crowded planet has become an empty one, at least in terms of human diversity, and whether that emptiness will be filled again by us or by something that comes after, no one can say. The night is dark, and the stars are the same stars that the Neanderthals looked up at, the same stars that guided Homo erectus across continents, the same stars that Homo naledi might have glimpsed through the opening of a cave. The Earth continues its slow rotation, indifferent to the species that walk its surface, patient in a way that no living thing can be. Mountains rise and erode, rivers carve new paths, forests grow and burn and grow again, and through it all, the story of life continues, with or without us, with or without any particular form or shape. The 9 species that walked the Earth 300,000 years ago are gone now, most of them, their bones scattered in caves and riverbanks and sediment layers that will someday be exposed by erosion or excavation or the slow movement of tectonic plates. But they were here. They lived. They struggled and survived and loved and died. And for a brief moment in geological time, the world was theirs as much as it was anyone's. They were not failures. They were experiments, variations on a theme, different answers to the same question. What does it mean to be human? And you, listening to this now, are the inheritor of their legacy. In your cells, in your genes, in the shape of your immune system and the color of your skin and the way your body processes oxygen, you carry fragments of their existence. You are not purely Homo sapiens. You are a mosaic, a living archive of the human family tree, carrying within you the echoes of species that disappeared before history began. Every breath you take is made possible, in part, by genes that evolved in bodies very different from yours, in environments you will never see, under pressures you can barely imagine. The world is quieter now than it was 300,000 years ago, quieter and in some ways lonelier. There is no one left to talk to who is not fundamentally like us, no other kind of human to meet on a distant shore or in a mountain pass, no chance encounter with someone who looks different, thinks different, sees the world through eyes shaped by a different evolutionary history. We are alone, the last branch on a tree that was once thick with possibilities, and whether we thrive or wither, whether we fill the earth with our descendants or vanish like the Neanderthals, the outcome will be ours alone to determine. But for now, in this moment, you are here, the product of 4 billion years of evolution, the descendant of fish and amphibians and early mammals and tree-dwelling primates and upright walking hominins, the inheritor of Neanderthal genes and Denisovan adaptations and the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who survived long enough to pass on their DNA. You are the result of an unbroken chain that stretches back to the origin of life itself, and that chain has never been broken, not once, not ever, through all the extinctions and catastrophes and climate shifts and near misses that could have ended it. Rest now. Let the story settle. The Neanderthals are at peace in their caves, their bones long since turned to stone. Homo erectus walked its last steps along the Solo River and left no descendants, but the memory of that walk is preserved in the fossil record, waiting to be found. The Denisovans, faceless and mysterious, live on in the blood of Tibetans and Melanesians, their legacy written not in monuments, but in genes. Homo floresiensis, the little people of Flores, are gone, but the island remembers them, and the stories told by villagers may carry echoes of encounters that happened thousands of years ago. Homo naledi rests in the dark chambers where it was found, and whether it buried its dead with intention or by accident we may never know, but the question itself is a gift, a reminder that the past is full of mysteries that resist easy answers. The earth turns, the stars wheel overhead, the continents drift, slow and inexorable, and somewhere in the deep future, another species may look back at us the way we look back at Homo erectus, wondering what we were like, how we lived, why we disappeared. They will find our bones, our tools, our cities reduced to geological layers, and they will try to reconstruct our lives from fragments, just as we do with the species that came before us. They will ask the same questions we ask. Were they intelligent? Did they have language? Did they know they were alone? And the answer, for us, is yes. We knew. We are the only ones who could know, because we are the only ones left to ask the question. The 9 are gone, but their story is not forgotten. It is written in stone, in bone, in the double helix of DNA that spirals through every cell of your body. It is written in the shape of your skull, the structure of your hands, the way your immune system recognizes threats. It is written in the mountains and rivers and caves that were their homes, and in the quiet persistence of the earth, which outlasts every species and every empire and every certainty. Let the ice ages come and go in your mind, the glaciers advancing and retreating, the sea levels rising and falling, the forests giving way to grasslands and back again. Let the hominins walk across your thoughts, upright and curious, carrying fire and stone, asking questions they could not yet answer, but passing those questions down to their children and their children's children, until eventually the questions reached you. You are the answer they were searching for, even if they did not know the question. You are what happens when a lineage survives long enough to look back at its own history and wonder what it all meant. You are the crowded planet reduced to one, the sole survivor asking why, and the asking itself is the only answer there is. Rest, the story is told, the stars remain, the earth endures, and in the morning, if there is a morning, the world will still be here, waiting to see what you will do with the inheritance you have been given. Good night.